Hello everyone, and welcome to another retrospective supercut here on OAM. This will be on the Samurai 7 retrospective, as I long to put everything together in order to stall for time while I work on my next retrospective. Anyways, please enjoy, and please forgive any audio inconsistencies caused by both the limited OST of this piece and my own recording inadequacies. Please enjoy, as we look upon this great, animated, obscure memory based upon a great, not-so-obscure live-action film. Now, Samurai 7 is oft overlooked, and my first memories of it go back to the early Toonami days, when the series was still airing in the States, and it seemed pretty cool to me. Where many series of the time were vaguely Western or cosmopolitan-looking, because the West was still warming up and learning of Japanese culture, Samurai 7 was undeniably Japanese. My initial memories with the series are hazy, and I never caught all of the series on air when they aired, but I knew of the general plot, and I knew that it was based off of the 3.5-hour epic, Seven Samurai. Upon rewatching the series to its conclusion, I can say that Samurai 7, while undeniably a remake or retelling of Seven Samurai, is still strong enough to stand on its own. However, since Samurai 7 is a remake of a previously told story, it is an odd piece to approach, since it is simultaneously original, and yet also a blatant remake or retelling of an iconic movie. That iconic movie being Seven Samurai, one of the most iconic movies of all time actually, and definitely one of the most influential. Like in the Trigun review, I will take the source material into consideration and bring it up when I feel necessary, but for the most part will try to focus on the series itself in a vacuum. This is not to discredit the source material, but instead to push the series out from under its shadows. I feel that these shadows, and a similar but not identical title, are perhaps one of the reasons Samurai 7 is still somewhat obscure, as remaking one of the most influential movies ever made is a daunting task even in the best of cases. Comparisons to the source material will thus be used when I feel needed, but comparing the series to the movie will not necessarily be the point of this retrospective, outside of perhaps a video dedicated strictly to that. Instead, the aim here is to see what makes the series good, regardless of whether or not that originates from the source material itself, or from within Samurai 7's retelling of it, and also to look at why Samurai 7 is a great, obscure anime memory. With that out of the way, let's start as we always do, by exploring the plot of Samurai 7, and seeing what happens. Samurai 7 opens up in the remote Kana village, where the villagers tremble in fear of having their crop taken from them again by the unjust bandits. Now the bandits are former samurai who have lost their way, their honor, and oftentimes even their bodies since the ending of the Great War. Now, all they really do is go about demanding tribute from defenseless farmers. Finally, having had enough of this, the village elder resolves to finally free the village from the bandits by hiring samurai to fight them off. In order to obtain the services of the samurai, the village sends out peasant Rikichi, the water priestess / shrine maiden Kiara, and Kiara's younger sister Kamachi to the city to recruit them. These three eventually make it to the big city, where they go about recruiting the Seven Samurai and just trying to avoid trouble. They first meet the inexperienced Katsushiro, who resolves to help them as it is the just thing to do, and as a samurai, he must do this. Now, it is shown from the start that he's quite inexperienced and naive, but throughout the series he grows to become a competent and more grounded warrior. They also befriend the loud Kikuchiyo, who is a mechanical samurai also looking to make a name for himself. Eventually they run into the older Kanbei, who initially refuses to join the team out of a sense of loss and disconnect. He is quite a jaded man after all. As time passes though, Kiara catches the attention of Ukyo, son of a local magistrate, who then kidnaps her. This sees Kanbei end up rescuing her, and joining the team next to the young Katsushiro and the brash Kikuchiyo. In the end, they all finally resolve to recruit more samurai to help protect the village. Although Kanbei doesn't consider the other samurai yet, he does allow them to tag along, and begrudgingly accepts Katsushiro as a student of sorts, and even acknowledges them as samurai eventually. As the group continues to try and recruit more samurai and avoid Ukyo, they run into and recruit the veteran samurai Gorobei, a friendly mechanically mined Heihachi, and Kanbei also has a close fight with samurai Gonzo, who happens to work for the local magistrate. With this decent team assembled, the group is then forced to flee as the city performs anti-samurai sweeps because they are of the belief that a samurai has killed the local envoy to the emperor. This sees the group flee to the village of healing, where Kanbei recruits his old friend Shichiroji, and then they flee further to a hidden village in a cave guarded by the mysterious Shikimori. It is here that Kanbei learns of the women kidnapped by the emperor and resolves to rescue them once the work in the village is all done. First though, the group must save the village, and along the way they are attacked by city forces, including Kuzo. Seeing someone who finally respects him as a warrior and a person though, Kuzo decides to betray his comrades and defect to join the now Seven Samurai, and one day duel Kanbei to the death. The group then makes it to the village where they fortify it and train the farmers to fight. They even survive an attempt by one of the villagers, Monzo, to betray them and rally the villagers to the struggle, as it is now too late to back down. This pays off, and in the final battle, the village successfully repels the bandits, though at the cost of Gorobei's life. This battle also sees Katsushiro take his first life, and eventually kind of pull the plug on his and Kiara's will-they-won't-they relationship, which kind of flickers on and off throughout the series. Having won the battle, the samurai stay in the village, with the exception of Kanbei, who goes out to rescue the women, and Kyuzo, who kinda just does his own thing. I would also like to note here that this is where the plot of the original movie kind of ends, and the next arc is mostly original to the anime adaptation, of course with many homages and references to the movie. To get to the Emperor, Kanbei confesses to killing the Imperial Envoy, something he didn't actually do, and this gets him an audience before the Emperor in the capital, a massive floating battleship. He almost succeeds in killing the Emperor too, though is instead captured and slated to be executed. This is delayed though when Ukyo, having usurped his father, demands an audience with the Emperor. This is granted and the Emperor recognizes him as a clone of himself, and forces him to undergo the test of inquiry to see if he will be a worthy successor. Ukyo passes and is thus named Crown Prince. He then takes advantage of this and kills the Emperor to gain control of the Empire. From here, he goes on a charm offensive, seeking to consolidate power by playing everyone against each other and hoisting himself above it all as a kind of benevolent overlord. He had already done something similar to this in the city, by seeking to win over the unemployed samurai and the peasants by employing these samurai to fend off bandit attacks on villages at the expense of the bandits, kind of modeling the defenses after what Kanbei had done for Kana village. In a show of goodwill, he even releases the captive women and pardons Kanbei, as Katsushiro, Kikuchiyo, and Kiara try to rescue him. Ukyo's charms succeed to an extent with the people, although our samurai are still very weary of him, and this is validated when Ukyo decides to destroy Kana village as a show of force. Before this attack can commence though, Katsushiro has a falling out with the group as he feels betrayed that Kanbei did not take him on his quest to free the women. He feels left out and belittled and heads off to the village to do his own thing, while Kanbei, Kiara, Kikuchiyo, and the captives rest in the village of healing. It is in this village where the remaining non-Katsushiro samurai rejoin the group and agree that the Emperor must be stopped. As they pursue the capital, they leave the women behind and charge straight for it. Meanwhile, Katsushiro has arrived in Kana and leads the defense of the village before the onslaught of the capital. The other five sneak aboard the capital and take it out to save the village. The samurai of course win, though at the cost of Heihachi, Kyuzo, and Kikuchiyo's life, who all die in the fight to stop and eventually kill the Emperor. As the battle ends and some time passes, the village is better than ever, and Kanbei gives Katsushiro his sword as a measure of both respect and accepting him as a full-fledged samurai. He then tells the village elder to live a good life, and laments that even though the farmers, quote, won, it is still another losing battle added to his name, as no victory can ever wash away the loss of oneself and one's friends. While this ending is a bit somber, I feel it is for the best. While Samurai 7 is a slightly more lighthearted adaptation of the original, complete with some goofy anime moments, it never loses focus on the important messages present. In fact, I was surprised with how poignant it could be at times. Many scenes spoke to me much more than I thought they would have, like when Rikichi gathers up his stolen rice in episode 1, or when Heihachi sacrifices himself to take out the capital. Many scenes can and do hit close to home, and they're all examples of a serious core bleeding through a polished animated exterior. Samurai 7 is fascinating for this reason, as it retains much of the emotional, social, and philosophical depth/commentary of the original, questioning mature themes, like can any death be honorable, and can combat be glorious, or is it just a necessity sometimes, all inside an extended and animated medium. This is strengthened by the ending, because retaining the grounded ending of the original is a great piece of connective tissue binding the series to the source material, and the themes to the viewers. Therefore, while the plot of Samurai 7 is pretty straightforward, I see no issue with this, as I consider it a beautiful exploration of humanity. Samurai 7 is neither a character nor a concept story, but instead a story which uses the differing actions, attitudes, and fates of its characters to dissect the human experience, especially when it comes to concerning themes of warfare, honor, and loss. While none of the characters are the deepest, many of them are still often quite developed, or at least fleshed out enough and unique enough to stand on their own. This allows us to open up to them on an emotional level and experience their humanity and learn from them. And this is the beauty of both the original movie and this retelling of it. Regardless of how futuristic or antiquated the gripping setting is, or how awesome the original soundtrack is, or how cool the fight scenes are, Samurai 7 is an exploration of the human condition. And that's why I love it. While the series does have its nuances and complexities and own quirks, its simple messages and tones, which shift between lighthearted to intense to somber reflection, display to us a wide range of emotions we will all experience at some point. For this reason, it's a great exploration of our psyche, and leads us to question both ourselves and the world and society around us. It's an exploration of humanity, and many of its aspects. It tells us to treasure the lives we live and the lives of those around us because life itself can be quite fragile. No matter who wins at the end of the day, living in it of itself is something of a reward. It is a great example of a story being human above all else, and being used to express humanity above anything else. And for that reason, it is also a great, obscure anime memory. And as is customary, the next thing we will be examining is the setting. Now, Samurai 7's setting is very unique, and I feel that it is the thing which sets it apart from the original the most. It's its standout it factor, differentiating it from the source material. While Seven Samurai is set in feudal Japan, and of course is very grounded in the realities of peasant life, Samurai 7's setting is a fanciful mix and exploration of several areas of which have a despondent level of technological advancement and their own unique charms. To start with the lands themselves, the world of Samurai 7 is divided into a few rich locations. There is the mystical Kana Valley village, set in the mountains and inhabited by peasants, living as those that came before them did centuries ago. Here, everything is done and harvested by hand. This is the initial setting of the series, and sees several great battles stain its pristine green fields and forests. Next, there is the big city, which serves as a near-complete foil to the village. Where the village is green and quiet, the city is gray and bustling. Where the village is rooted in the past, the city is leaning into a new future. It is cramped and full of strangers and new technologies, all cramming together in a very confined, clustered space. In between these two is the Village of Healing, a vibrant entertainment district incorporating both tradition and technology, and, past this, a cave system and a vast desert. Above all of this, literally, is the capital, an incredibly and impossibly advanced flying battleship, decorated and molded into forms and arts of old though. All of these lands are vibrant and beautiful backdrops that the viewer can easily get lost in and explore on their own. Every land feels unique and has its own air about it. They also, however, show a despondent level of technological development, further ingraining the viewer into a sort of odd steampunk world. A world that is both feudal and in the past, and advanced and heading towards the future. This serves to raise a great question about the time period that this world takes place in. Is it an era of the past or the future? You see, in this sort of steampunk feudal Japan, technological development is extremely imbalanced. The futuristic lives side by side with the past in a relatively harmonious blend. The same anime has giant mechs, laser cannons, and cyborgs exist side by side with feudal peasants, ancient traditions, and samurai armed only with swords. On one hand, the setting of Samurai 7 is very futuristic, and one might initially see it as a sort of Seven Samurai from the future. There are cyborgs and lasers and flight and cloning and many other high-tech aspects which, even in the real world, we have yet to truly master. However, seeing this as a strictly futuristic setting is of course an overgeneralization, as there is a lot of nuance here. While some aspects of the world may be impossibly advanced, there are also many more aspects of the world which are very much rooted in the past. This is shown by the technological floor of most of society, and in some ways the people themselves. Now, when I say the technological floor, I mean the lowest levels of technology often employed, at least en masse. We see throughout the series that while certain technological marvels are available to a select few, the majority of people live either as poor farmers, lacking any complex technology, to city commoners that use equipment that would be about or a little behind what we have today. At the lowest end, the farmers lack almost any technology above feudal levels. The crops are planted and harvested by hand, to the beat of drums and the blessings of ancient priests. The villages are quite underdeveloped, and this sets a very low technological floor in a series which also has a very high technological ceiling. This creates a sort of world of contradictions and differences, even if they all mesh together quite well most of the time. This clash and contradiction of past and present even extends into some production aspects of the series. The original soundtrack of Samurai 7 is a production aspect anchored in the past, as it is almost all inspired by traditional Japanese music. Pieces like Samurai and Kiara make extensive use of traditional Japanese percussion, rhythms, and woodwinds to establish a connection to the past. On the topic of the soundtrack, while it isn't the most extensive, it definitely is very strong, with each piece infusing its scenes with a certain energy. The piece Samurai and its variants, for example, imbue combat scenes with the energy of ancient battles of the past, feeding into the primal fury and emotion of combat. Other pieces, like Kiara, serve to complement this by reflecting upon the loss of battle, and the grim history of battles past, with slower and more pensive, thoughtful rhythms and beats. Like a true honorable samurai, the original soundtrack is actually very well rounded between fast and decisive action pieces and slower moments of thoughtfulness and contemplation. And like a samurai of old, it also evokes imagery and feelings of a mythicized past just out of reach. Contradicting audio production aspects set in the past, there are also some visual production aspects rooted in the present, or maybe even future. Of special note here is the use of CG, a visual medium which one could argue is a futuristic thing, or rooted in the future. While I at first found the use of CG a little off-putting, as I'm kind of a snob who will always insist on the superiority of hand-drawn animation, I understand that from a production standpoint, CG is often simply a lot more practical many times. As the series progressed though, I soon came to accept the use of CG within it. For one, the CG, at least by 2004 standards, looks pretty good. In addition, it isn't overused. The sparing use of it allows it to be used in conjunction with traditional animation techniques, which I feel is the best way to use CG. I'm glad that the producers took this approach, as it prevents the CG materials from standing out too much from the production. However, the fact that the CG does stick out is also kind of a strength of the show, as the sparing use of it is reserved for mechs and futuristic aspects of the series. This literally sets them apart from the animated world around them, and sees them stick out even more. In this case, though, that's good, as the mechs themselves are technological outliers no matter how they're animated. The fact that they stick out emphasizes how futuristic and alien certain aspects of this world are, even if it seems rooted in the past. This in turn establishes the world of Samurai 7 as a world where, even with select great technological advances, much of the tech used by many of the people would still be undoubtedly considered out of date, or around what we have now. It is a world of both the far past and the far future. All of the technological contradictions present here lead the viewer to a central questioning of the setting though, and to ask, is this a land of the past or future? There are arguments for either side here, as there is no clear-cut answer, but I think that's intentional. In fact, I think answering this question is kind of irrelevant, as the answer is meant to be that this is a kind of world and time upon itself. There is no real analog to it, as it's its own unique thing. And this is great, as it allows the setting to serve two other important purposes. This great mismatch of old, present, and new technologies serves to jar the viewer, and kind of force them into the world of Samurai 7, to mostly positive results. By establishing it as a completely unique world, which is all over the place in terms of temporal setting, the setting forces us to discard any previous mental images and ideas going into the series, and immerse ourselves into its own unique world, in this specific rendition of a classic tale. This can make sure that this rendition stands on its own, and yet doesn't necessarily alter the main point or plot of the source material too much. The setting helps distinguish this series, and yet allows it to remain relatively loyal to the source material. Sure, sometimes the inconsistencies seem like a bit much, and there are a few times it can distract or even come off as a bit silly, like the samurai reflecting a massive battleship cannon using only a sword, but for the most part, the atmosphere is enough to overlook the sillier moments and establish the series as its own thing. This atmosphere gives the series a kind of timeless feel, though since the technological floor is more prevalent than the technological ceiling, it is slightly skewed towards the past. All of this in turn serves to fortify the importance and power of the morals and message of the series itself. Again, it should be noted that while this exotic setting is very bizarre and very unique and special, the setting itself doesn't really alter the plot or the morals too much when we look at it, especially compared to the source material. And I consider this a strength of the series, as it's a testament to the strength of the message of the series, and the original. It means that the world is irrelevant to the lessons learned here, and to the humanity experience. It means that the power of the human experience can transcend material boundaries, and that we as a species can empathize with others even if in very different situations, locations, and times. If the world of Samurai 7 is an impossibly fantastic land of technological inconsistencies, of ancient traditions, and many other things in between, a sort of land outside of time, but the lessons and morals of the original still apply here all the same and just as strongly, it means that those lessons and morals are truly timeless and universal. It means that the point of the story is always relevant and therefore impactful and strong. It means that no matter who we are and where we may be, we can all relate to similar ideals and hope to strive to be the best versions of ourselves. And with the plot and setting addressed, let's start addressing some characters. Now with such a large cast, I was at first a little confused on how to address every character, or whether or not I should. Obviously, major characters like Kanbei and Katsushiro will get their own full-length episodes, but before we get there, let's warm up with some important supporting characters. Also, quick note, there are some differences between each version of the character between the original movie and this adaptation of it. While those are very interesting, I will save talking about those differences for an episode specifically dedicated to the differences between the source material and this adaptation of it. as I feel that otherwise I would unnecessarily bring up the source material excessively. And I do know of quite a few small differences, although again I'd like to save that for an episode noting specifically those things. For our first character though, I'd like to look at one of the funnest samurai of Samurai 7, Gorobei. Now, Gorobei appears as early as episode 1, though only really addresses the party in episode 3. He introduces himself to a fleeing Katsushiro and Kikuchiyo as a street performer who loves to make wagers. He challenges Katsushiro to shoot him with a Yumi to see whether or not he'll catch the arrow before it goes through his skull. Now, at first Katsushiro refuses to give in to his goading, although he later gives in and shoots. Gorobei catches the arrow just as it nicks the very top layer of his skull, and in turn decides to follow the two back to their base in the city. It is here that Gorobei, a seeming fan of adventure, decides to join the team, and quickly becomes a friendly voice of authority and veterancy. He helps the group recruit more samurai, and flees with them from the city when the time comes. Along the way, he is always quick to assist his peers in a fight, and dispense friendly and often very good life advice. When the group makes it back to the village, Gorobei helps the villagers prepare for battle, though is ultimately killed from the blast of a gun. As the group finishes off the last giant mech, Gorobei passes in Katsushiro's arms with the line, "You must be joking." And I think that these are very appropriate last words for the man to speak, as above all, he was the voice of enjoying life and living in the moment. He was a man who could be very serious, and was obviously very skilled, but chose not to reflect on the grim nature of life because, in his own words, when life gets hard, you have to laugh. And this sums up Gorobei's presence and views better than anything else. He was a man truly aware of his mortality, and for that reason often sought to laugh at it. As a veteran of many wars and a seemingly older gentleman, it is no doubt that he had seen his fair share of unpleasant things, but instead of growing embittered by this, like say Kanbei, he instead grows to treasure what he does have. He knows that he is only human, but instead of loathing this, he instead chooses to embrace the experience and the fun parts of life. This is evident in everything he does. He uses his skills, not to become a mercenary or tradesman after the war, but instead to become a performer for the people. He uses his voice not for harshly criticizing others, but instead to try and lift them up. In fact, he's a sort of foil to Kanbei. While Kanbei comes off as distant and austere, Gorobei is warm and relaxed from the start. This, combined with their mutual respect, is probably why they work so well with each other. This laughing at mortality, though, even factors into Gorobei's fighting style and techniques. While he isn't the most brash samurai, his techniques are often very risky and delicate. Often he does not just dodge projectiles, but instead goes out of the way to try and catch them. In the midst of combat, he seems to have a sort of exhilaration about almost being struck down. When he does decide to dodge blows, he tends to just barely do it, and the scar on his face fascinates him. He has a flair for the dramatic, which serves as an assertion of his life and existence, a sort of taunt to death itself. That's not to say Gorobei is a psychopath or anything. In fact, he's probably the nicest of the samurai, and serves instead as a sort of father figure, or at least helpful friend for many characters. His approachable manner and life experiences make him a great source of knowledge and support for much of the younger cast. As someone who has lived through much, he often serves as a voice of reassurance for those fearing how to live in the future. He is sort of a warm center of the group of the samurai, and his presence helps the group meld together quite well, and harmoniously. This makes his death even more impactful, as he was one of the samurai that helped keep it together the most, as both the old and young respected him and listened to him, and both the old and young treasured his calm and friendly presence. Unfortunately though, Gorobei is mortal, and he is the first of the samurai to be struck down. Looking back on the series, it does do a good job of foreshadowing this, as Gorobei always did seem to have something of a subtle air of doubt in regards to his abilities, and he does have several close calls throughout the series. From the very start, in fact, he kinda marks himself when he almost gets himself killed by Katsushiro's arrow. He just barely catches it as it grazes his forehead. All of this shows that there's more to Gorobei than just his love of life and carefree attitude though, that these kind of mask over a layer of thoughtfulness and subtle seriousness. While he undoubtedly relishes being as close to death as possible in combat, it doesn't seem he enjoys combat itself too much. He is a peaceful man in fact, and sees no honor in getting oneself killed, considering living to be the ultimate victory, the ultimate defiance of death. This probably stems from his past experiences, as he probably saw a lot of carnage in the Great War, and considers himself lucky to be alive. He knows he's lucky too, and perhaps that's why he loves to wager and put on a show. He always seems subtly aware of how dangerous life can get, and for this reason doesn't mind getting dangerous to prove himself. His techniques are quite intense and delicate after all, and he always seems to be on the razor's edge when in combat. He taunts death because he seems aware that it will get him in the end no matter what, and he figures he might as well flex on it while he still can. Because even though he loves the styling of all this, it also seems that there is something of a physical component to this as well. He might be forced to do so due to his age. While his age is never explicitly stated, it does seem that Gorobei is either the oldest or one of the oldest samurai in the group, and age might be starting to blunt his skills. Note how in several fights he is nicked or grazed, when it is obvious, at least to him, that a younger Gorobei would have easily dodged such attacks. Note when he just barely misses catching the arrow that was bound for Katsushiro's leg. This is a man who knows he's capable of great things, but also knows that he is not as capable as he used to be. This seems to make him a bit uneasy on occasion, as he seems subtly aware of his reduced capabilities, though he never lets this discomfort him enough to stop him, as he knows that he still has many capabilities, and it is his passion to use his capabilities while he still can, to laugh at the face of mortality. He lives according to his own code of bluster and pizzazz, on his own terms. He knows that death will come for him in some shape or form eventually, and that while this is frightening, it is an inevitability, so he has accepted it enough to try and live on his own terms while he can. He knows that he's slowing down, and while it does create a small air of doubt, it also feeds into his fun and defiant nature in such dangerous circumstances. He knows he could die at any moment, and he doesn't let that stop him. Instead, he lets it fuel him to enjoy life as much as possible, to enjoy what he does have while he does have it, and to wager on as much as possible, so that he, for as long as possible, can continue to laugh at the expense of his own mortality, and so that he can put on the performance of a lifetime. As a showman, one of the things that Gorobei is known most for is how he smiles through all of his performances. However, I would argue that his smile is not as iconic as the smile of the next samurai, and that is Heihachi. Now, Heihachi is introduced in episode 5 as a drifter who exchanges manual labor for food and trinkets. The group eventually run into him, and he joins the party with no reservations after Gorobei requests it. He is excited to get his share of rice and seems pretty friendly. He's also very helpful, as he quickly establishes himself as the engineer of the group. In fact, in the Great War, he served as a combat engineer, and he is an indispensable member of the team. He repairs many items, constructs many trinkets, and is even pivotal in several close escapes. Once the group make it to the village, he sees to the engineering tasks necessary and enthusiastically supports beheading Gonzo for attempting to betray the samurai. He constructs the giant ballista for the village and helps the team defeat the bandits after this, and, with victory, he stays behind to help rebuild Kana, though he eventually does join up with the remaining samurai when they resolve to destroy the capital and take down the emperor. As he does so, he and Kanbei have a talk where Heihachi reveals that he has lived with the guilt of betraying his old platoon since the end of the war, and he looks to atone for it. This is also why he hates betrayal, and seems to want to decapitate anyone even considering it. Having already figured all of this out though, Kanbei welcomes Heihachi to the final battle. And this final battle does see Heihachi redeem himself, as he successfully sacrifices himself to destroy the capital's engine, and thus bring it down and save Kana village. This leads us to examine Heihachi's character, which is a surprisingly complex one. He is a certified samurai, but doesn't really seem to hold himself up as one. Instead, he kinda just does his own thing and tries to live a carefree life. He's a very friendly man, and seems to enjoy simply living. He often parrots Gorobei's statement that one must laugh when times get tough, and his friendly nature helps hide the shame and self-loathing that is deep within him. It is not a facade though, and as someone aware of the fragile nature of life, he seems to be genuinely grateful for the fact that he is alive. He knows that life is precious and that he should treasure it. This feeds into his carefree nature and his love of rice, as he instinctively wants to shy away from death, and perhaps even the impact of his past mistakes. He is aware of them, however, is quite self-aware, and thus isn't shy about his lack of swordsmanship and his love of rice. He knows that life is fragile, and since he's already sort of cheated to get where he is, he at the very least should attempt to redeem himself. Now this cheating, of course, was the betrayal of his previous platoon, which he did so out of fear during the Great War. This friendly veneer at first makes it seem as though Heihachi is simply a simple man, without any real depth, but all it really does is serve to cover his inner fear, guilt, self-loathing, and a sort of zen wisdom about him. While Heihachi becomes a brave samurai, he, initially, by his own admission, is not the bravest, and doesn't care for combat. We can see this, in fact, with his combat debut, in which he uses his intellect and tools to indirectly win the fight as opposed to direct combat and strength. This reflects his smarts and technical skills, but also reflects upon his fear and dislike of combat. This fear should be noted because it was the source of his self-loathing. This self-loathing, of course, comes from his past instance of betrayal, which he did so out of fear. While Heihachi commented on never having cut anyone down before joining the group, he still joins the group as a man with blood on his hands. To make things worse, it is the blood of his former comrades, which he sold out of fear. This irreparably stains his honor, and since no one else seems to know about it, it is left to him to figure out how to redeem himself, and until he does, This irreparable stain on his honor festers within him, causing a sense of guilt and self-loathing. To cope with this, he resolves to try and live a carefree life in the meantime, to both try and distance himself from his past, and to sort of discredit himself as a samurai. He can no longer see himself as a true samurai because of his past mistakes, and thus doesn't really care if others do or don't either. For this reason, he now puts a premium on loyalty, and he refuses to elevate himself as he sees himself as a sort of failure. This explains why he never seems to take his status too seriously, and why he is always so humble. It is a sort of atonement, as he sees himself as someone unworthy of the honor which comes with being a samurai. This also explains why he lashes out so aggressively at those who would betray others. While his fever to decapitate Monzo seems very out of character at first for such a laid-back man, it actually makes perfect sense in context, as he is not only lashing out against a possible enemy, but also himself, and his past mistakes, and the parts of himself which he doesn't really like. And this sets the stage for a good redemption arc. As if Heihachi is trying to quietly live in shame, why would he join such an outrageous quest? He does so because he knows that he's tired of having to live with himself and not doing anything about it. He wants to prove himself to both the world and himself that he can be a loyal and productive member of society. This isn't out of some sort of pride or drive for glory, but instead out of a simple wish to prove he can be loyal and serve a greater cause, to prove himself to others and himself. This explains how Heihachi can be both very friendly and humble and carefree, yet also assign himself to such a dangerous and complex task with such diligence. Because of his past transgressions, he doesn't take himself or his status very seriously, but he does his task and mission, as they are a way to atone for his past transgressions. This creates a man who naturally falls in line as a sort of friendly specialist for the team. While Heihachi does have moments of seriousness, he's often a very fun man who those in the group can turn to for support, whether friendly or technical. Quick tangent here, it is when giving this friendly advice that Heihachi's wisdom starts to come out. Throughout the series, Heihachi has a sort of zen knowledge about him, often answering questions indirectly or in a thought-provoking way. We see this most in his interactions with Kikuchiyo, who, after asking a deep question, will often get a deeper answer. For example, Kikuchiyo asks him, what makes one a samurai? To which Heihachi responds something along the lines of, look in your reflection. He doesn't answer like this to be rude or sarcastic, but instead to kind of provoke inner thought, and help Kikuchiyo grow to get to know himself. Heihachi can do this because even if he doesn't like parts of himself, he is still pretty self-aware, and thus in a way pretty wise. Now this wisdom has nothing to do with his position as the engineer, as while the engineer, it can be argued that he's the quote, smartest of the group. Answering like this proves that he knows the difference between intellect and wisdom. This is important as it also means he helps the viewer distinguish between the two as well. Knowing how to construct a massive ballista using only feudal technology definitely makes you smart. But it doesn't necessarily say anything of your inner wisdom, which is more reflected upon what the purpose of the ballista is, and how you came to the conclusion that you would need one, and your methodology for answering the previous questions, and so on and so forth. In fact, Heihachi's character serves as kind of a great discussion of the debate of intelligence versus wisdom. This is shown by the duality of life and death, and the choices he has made to get where he is currently in his life. Now, as a living organism, Heihachi naturally wants to continue living. A manifestation of this is the fear of dying. Fear isn't fun, so ideally the source of fear should somehow be rectified. Thus, a quote, intelligent conclusion is that something that eases this fear is good, even if the fear itself isn't always rational or wise. Therefore, to ease the fear and maximize his chances of living, Heihachi, quote, made the, quote, intelligent decision to sell out his old platoon. Now, from the view of maximizing one's own continued survival, it could be argued that this was the, quote, intelligent decision, as it at least either potentially or statistically helped him achieve his goal of survival. But it wasn't the wise decision, as it also means that even if successful, he would have to live with the shame of betraying those close to him, and the mental and spiritual ramifications of this. These ramifications would be magnified, especially if the betrayal wasn't even needed, if the betrayal wasn't even that logical of a decision. This means that the seeming smart answer still had quite big consequences. Heihachi has come to realize this, and seems to know this now, and deeply regrets his past actions. He is self-aware enough and wise enough to know that he messed up, and that intelligence is not necessarily the same as wisdom, and both are needed to live a balanced life. His past actions, which were seemingly guided out of either an instinctual or cold intelligence, have led him to completely reevaluate himself and look down upon himself for betraying others. and perhaps the pain of this is even where Heihachi has got his current wisdom from. Anyways, it is nice that Heihachi helps to distinguish between the two, because doing so helps bring out and emphasize some of the key themes of the production. He can do this because he is both intelligent and wise. In fact, this wisdom, not his intellect, seems to be another driving factor for him joining the team, as he is self-aware enough to know that he wants a chance to redeem himself so he can finally move on. His self-awareness helps him put the mission above himself by instilling an odd mix of humble confidence and self-loathing drive. It should be noted his humility helps him get along well with basically everyone the vast majority of the time, and his drive ensures he's always there for them, never to falter again. In fact, he values all those alongside him because they and their quests are the ones giving him such a chance to redeem himself. And redeem himself he does. While initially fearful behind the scenes, Heihachi doesn't shy from combat once he joins the team, and engages in it regularly. He shows himself to be quite skilled, even though he doesn't say he is, and he overcomes his inhibitions, eventually unflinchingly sacrificing himself for the greater good. While betraying one's comrades might have been the quote intelligent thing to do in the past, Heihachi now knows that it was never the wise thing. He also knows that he must live according to a sort of code of honor if he ever wishes to redeem himself, because being true to oneself is a wise thing to do, because it means that you can live with oneself and grow as a person. He's come to terms with his past though, and, now an even wiser man, decides that he should take one for the team, and the greater good. While he laments having to die, he does so to strike down the capital, and for the greater good. And with his final redemptive sacrifice, pushes that detonator with a smile, knowing that he has finally redeemed himself. Having risen to the occasion, and proven that he is willing to do anything simply to help the righteous causes around him, and the righteous people pursuing those causes. Another example of someone throwing everything away to help those who need help the most is Shichiroji, arguably the most well-rounded samurai, and the one which forms a sort of emotional core of the seven. He's a great example of not only warrior spirit, but also of the calm and practical nature needed to wield said spirit effectively, and only when necessary. And the fact that he leaves his business and even his family behind to help those around him proves his merit as both a warrior and a person. Now, Shichiroji is an interesting character to look at, as he is what I would consider the sort of ultimate side or supporting character. He isn't too fleshed out, but still has plenty of identity to himself, and serves to enhance the characters whom he shares scenes with. He isn't the best samurai, but is still extremely skilled. He isn't the most gregarious, but is still quite friendly and supportive. He isn't the most prolific, but is still quite important, and happens to show up in a lot of scenes where other people do very important things. He is his own man, but greatly enhances those around him. So what does he do? When Shichiroji is introduced, he is introduced as the proprietor of the Firefly Inn, where he works with his fiancée and a few other staff members to cater to all sorts of people. He seems to genuinely enjoy his work, and takes great care of both his fiancée and their guests. From this introduction, he is shown to be quite a capable samurai, although one that also appreciates the virtues of restraint and calm. After harboring Kanbei and crew for a little bit, he elects to go along with them, as he feels loyalty to his friend coming about, and he longs for one last hurrah. This sees Shichiroji join the crew, and he turns out to be a great asset in combat and strategy. In the village, he oversees fortification efforts and construction, and repels numerous bandits when the battles actually begin. After the conclusion of the first battles, he stays behind to oversee reconstruction of the village, although he does eventually join up with the rest of the samurai when it comes time to take down the capital. In this conflict, he fights his way through numerous foes, and even comes face to face with Ukyo, though he nearly dies and just barely escapes. He does so, however, and is one of the 3 samurai to live to the very end. He is present in the last scene, where he remarks on how well everything turned out, only to be told by Kanbei that they still both lost. With all this explained, let's now ask, what is the importance of Shichiroji? Now, Shichiroji is important for 3 main reasons. The first is that he humanizes Kanbei by being his great friend and old acquaintance. The second is that he stands to represent the importance of inner peace, confidence, and interacting with others. And the third is that he represents a kind of longing for the past, as he, more than anyone else, is the one who likes to reflect on the good old days. We will of course begin by exploring the first point. The first point connects to Shichiroji being the ultimate support character in both a literal and literary sense. From a literal point of view, it's quite obvious, as his great martial prowess helped the group win numerous battles, and he proves himself to be a great help. From a character and emotional point of view, this is also relatively apparent. While he isn't the emotional core of the group, he is still a very approachable and friendly man. As a man who has seen many battles, he knows the nature of both war and peace, and wants to help those around him navigate both successfully. While he is friendly and helpful to the younger cast, we see this help most apparently in his interactions and relationship with Kanbei. Kanbei even goes as far to call him his old wife. This greatly humanizes Kanbei, and both of their interactions seem to genuinely show humanity in both of them. Initially, Kanbei is a rather cold man, or at least seems to be, and Shichiroji's admiration of him is the first hint that this is not entirely true. The two seem to get along from the start, and even share some poignant conversations about the past, which the two seem a bit stuck in. This establishes them as friends who deeply understand each other, and this in turn establishes Kanbei as capable of empathy and valuing humanity. Shichiroji is critical to getting the ball rolling when it comes to peeling back Kanbei's tired and jaded exterior. The fact that Shichiroji himself is so warm and relaxed also shows that Kanbei is a human at his core, as his best friend is many of the things he seems not to be. That they are opposites greatly humanizes Kanbei, and further establishes Shichiroji as a voice of unity and warmth. In line with this warmth, Shichiroji also seems to be the man most at peace with himself among the group. To prove this, let's compare him to the other samurai. All of the veterans of the Great War, Kanbei, Gorobei, Heihachi, and himself, all handled their experiences and traumas differently, though of all these, Shichiroji seems to be the most honest in his approach, and the most in touch with himself, or at least the most comfortable with himself. Kanbei is a jagged and weary man, who while still possessing a good heart, is not always able to let it shine through. As such, he tends to come off as rather aloof and isolated. Gorobei is the exact opposite, going on to love the spectacle of life, though sometimes at the cost of his better judgment. While he is extremely social and friendly, this sometimes seems as though it may be for the spectacle of things, as he simply loves fun interactions. Heihachi, due to his past actions, goes on to be an odd mix of these two approaches. While he is friendly like Gorobei, he was, before joining the group, an isolated drifter who tended to keep almost entirely to himself. These characters, while proving themselves to be great warriors and men, show that they are never quite comfortable with either themselves, reaching out to others emotionally, or a mix of the two, unlike Shichiroji, who seems both comfortable with himself and interacting with others. Next, let's compare him to the younger cast, who are still maturing into their final forms. Kyuzo is quite aloof and quiet, and while going on to prove himself a confident and honorable warrior, seems to be somewhere in between a tad apathetic to completely disconnected when it comes to human interaction. Kikuchiyo is brash and loud, often acting recklessly in an overconfident or overcompensating manner. Katsushiro is held back by his conflict of confidence/conscience between his naive ideals and grim realities that come with being a warrior. All of this is to say that all of the samurai have some sort of issue or coldness to them, and Shichiroji is a nice subversion of this. He's just a helpful guy, confident, but not arrogant about himself. Now when I say confident in this context, I do not simply mean confident in his own abilities, or skills, or ideas. Many of the cast are confident in at least one of these aspects of themselves, but I mean confident in who he is as a person, balancing his past, present, and future to healthfully respect oneself and those around him. What I'm saying is that he is confident in who he is as a person. He wants to help, but for no real reason other than to support his friends, and maybe have a bit of fun along the way. He doesn't seem bogged down by some great inner turmoil, and he isn't jaded by years of fights. Instead, and I mean this in the best possible way, he's just some guy with a cool robot hand. And while he does long for the past every now and again, he's quite alive in the present, having a well-functioning life and even business. He's not isolated like Kanbei or Heihachi are initially, but he doesn't go all out like Gorobei or Kikuchiyo do. He isn't completely aloof, or still maturing into his final form like Kyuzo or Katsushiro, but instead quietly comfortable in his own skin and confident about himself and who he is as a person. Instead, he maintains a nice life, professional and social, at his inn. He works and supports many, and it always does so in a healthy and respectful way. We can see this most with his interactions with his fiancée, whom he seems to genuinely love and respect. In fact, their relationship is probably the only healthy romantic one we see last throughout the majority of the show, and it speaks to how stable and honest and confident a man he is. He doesn't cut himself off like Kanbei or Heihachi or Kyuzo, but he doesn't go all out for attention either, like say Gorobei or Kikuchiyo and perhaps Katsushiro do from time to time. Instead, he seeks a balanced approach to life and values his past, but he knows that he must live in the present and take care of those he loves, whom he also makes sure to support and seek support from when needed. He is comfortable enough with himself to do so, and it could be argued in fact that these healthy interactions and relationships are one of the reasons why he seems so at peace with himself, why he seems so mellow, as they may have helped to validate himself. He is a great role model for any person as he confidently balances the needs of himself and the needs of others to benefit both. He seems to be the most at peace with himself of all the samurai, even when taking into account the younger ones who may not necessarily have the same kind of emotional baggage the older ones might. He rarely reacts with much alarm to anything, and always goes into situations with a level head. Along with Gorobei, he's probably the only one here without anything to really prove, and acts simply out of his goodwill. Again, he's a great role model for all of us, as he shows the power that a confident person can portray. While he isn't necessarily the most skilled, he is able to make extremely good use of all of his skills because of how confident he is in himself. Of course, he isn't arrogant or anything, he doesn't cross that line. I would just like to say that he serves as a great everyman, or great just some guy character. And in this way, he's pretty relatable, if not arguably the most relatable of all the samurai. I'm sure everyone can relate to all the samurai at some point. Katsushiro trying to prove himself, Kikuchiyo trying to be bigger than he really is, Kanbei trying to get over difficult fights and loss. They're all relatable characters. However, Shichiroji is especially relatable in how normal he is. Again, that's not to deride either him or the other characters, it's simply a testament to how likable a character he is. While before this, every other samurai seemed to be either going about great moral quandaries or doing something kind of weird or dubious, Shichiroji was just some guy who wanted to run a small business with his wife, or soon-to-be wife. He just does his own thing, and he kind of respects everyone. He believes in the power of interactions, and he supports those he loves, and is supported by those who love him. He is, again, not to sound repetitive, a great example of some guy. And I think this is his hidden strength. I think this might even be why he relates to Kanbei so well, and why Kanbei can take great comfort in him, and that Shichiroji is just a very good and generally supportive person. This allows him to be at both peace with himself and his past, which he even nostalgically reminisces over sometimes. And this reminiscence is the final aspect of his character I'd like to discuss, as while he is aware of the pain of the past, he still seems to remember it, a little fondly at least, and in this way, he kind of embodies the longing for the past we all might face in the face of uncertainty. He knows the past wasn't the greatest, but still idealizes the simplicity of it. He knows he lives in an uncertain era, and thus loves the fact that the past is set in stone. While he doesn't obsess over it, he does allow it to comfort him from time to time, and often talks to Kanbei about it. He knows he lives in the present, it's just that he allows himself to take pleasure in the past, as it helps him find an inner peace, and connect to his inner confidence, and find a balance that we should all take note of. With 3 of 7 samurai explained, it's time to make it 4 of 7. And today, we will do that by analyzing the character Kuzo. Now Kuzo is a very interesting character to look at, since he barely talks, and isn't what you would call a central character of the series. That doesn't mean he's useless, however, and that doesn't mean we can't learn anything from him. He can still teach us quite a few things, like how much louder actions speak when compared to words, and how one must always balance the need to live for oneself with the need for living for one others, and how we should all try to try living. Now Kuzo is introduced in episode 5, as a samurai enforcer working for the local magistrate, Amaro. Now Amaro has several samurai enforcers, so this isn't too odd, although they all seem either disconnected to their employer or borderline psychopathic. Anyways, Kuzo seems to be the most skilled by far, and soon engages Kanbei in a fight, although he refrains from killing him after Kanbei acknowledges the skill and strength and ability that Kuzo possesses. It seems that this is the first time anyone really seems to address Kuzo as a person, and not just a tool. It is here that Kuzo vows to one day fight Kanbei to the death, one-on-one. After this though, he kinda just tags along with Ukyo as he pursues the group, doing so up until the point where they all get to the desert. It is here Kuzo betrays his dishonorable employers, and he decides to join the main cast. Again, it should be noted that his motivation for doing so is to protect Kanbei so they can fight to the death one day on their own terms, and so that he can, in his own words, try living. From here, Kuzo establishes himself as a very aloof, but very skilled warrior. He trains the villagers in archery, and is pivotal in taking down the bandits during the first battles for Kana village. After these are victorious for the village, he disappears for a bit to do his own thing, even saving his old boss out of pity, and eventually reunites with the group to join up with them for the capital strike. In this final engagement, Kuzo slices his way through Imperial forces and seems as skilled as ever, though is unfortunately killed by friendly fire when Katsushiro panics and tries to save Kanbei with a volley of bullets. Now these bullets do accomplish the task of saving Kanbei by shooting the man who is about to stab him. Unfortunately, Kuzo was right behind that man, and so is also brought down. However, Kuzo doesn't seem to be upset about this. He doesn't regret not being able to fight Kanbei, or even dying, but instead seems happy with his life, simply saying, "I'll be waiting for you, Kanbei," implying that he still looks forward to their fight, just on another plane of existence, and that in his eyes, he lived a good life, free of regrets, or at least any worth noting at this point. And this gets us to the character discussion of Kikuchiyo. Again, as mentioned earlier, of all the samurai, he speaks the least, but he can still teach us many things. He teaches us that actions speak louder than words, and that one needs to live for oneself, or at least take oneself into account when making important life decisions. To start with the first point, Kikuchiyo is a man of action more than anything else. While he seems to be at least relatively intelligent, he never spends much, if any, time deliberating or pondering. Instead, if he sees a solution readily available, he'll just go for it. He believes more in doing than thinking or talking, and while a natural loner, still works extremely well in a team setting, always contributing to the greater good. In fact, the show goes out of its way to establish this once he joins the main cast, as shortly after doing so, Kiara wonders why he never talks, to which Shichiroji replies, "He does, it's just his actions speak louder than his words." And for Kikuchiyo, this is truly the case, as he rarely talks, but always speaks. He takes his role seriously and he never wavers, all the while never physically saying much of anything along the way. Instead, he lets his actions demonstrate to everyone that he's quite skilled and takes the mission quite seriously. His actions are such that, though, that we can even still make some limited insights into his character. These insights are that he does seem to have some warrior ideals and value them, at least to some extent, as he seems to loathe having to work for the amoral Amaro and Ukyo. We can see this in the expressionless faces he wears when in their company and listening to them, and in an inverse of this, how much respect he seems to have for Kanbei. While he never goes out of his way to say he respects Kanbei, we can tell that he does, because of how he works alongside him. He subordinates himself out of respect, as Kanbei is the first man to recognize Kikuchiyo as anything more than a tool. And while Kikuchiyo always sticks to wanting to duel Kanbei to the death, the fact that he professionally waits until after the mission is complete also speaks to his high ideals, and his high respect for Kanbei. There were many times in the series where Kikuchiyo could have drawn a line in the sand, and forced Kanbei to engage, but he never even seems to consider doing this before the completion of the mission. This, and his unflinching dedication to said mission, proved that at his core he's an honorable, or at least patient man. It also hints that he's grateful to the group, and especially Kanbei, for allowing him to join them, as this mission has finally allowed him to live for himself. However, while he claims to be living for himself now, his dedication to the mission and team also prove he is not inherently selfish or arrogant. On the topic of living for oneself, Kikuchiyo proves the importance of doing so to both himself and the viewer. Again, while he is proven not to be inherently selfish or rude, he does decide to embark on this quest for himself. And there's nothing wrong with that. He proves that doing something for oneself can be quite beneficial to both the individual and the collective, and that everyone needs to take themselves into account when making important decisions. In the beginning of the series, when Kikuchiyo was on a city payroll, it was obvious that he wasn't really attached to his job, or the current state of affairs. He kind of just apathetically went along with things and felt unalive as a result, letting others decide what he would do and when he would do it. After meeting Kanbei, though, and feeling humanized for what seems to be the first time in a while, and stewing over his offer a little, Kikuchiyo decides to change his mind, and finally decides for himself. He's tired of having others decide for him, and not living for himself, and just going through the motions, and as such, he resolves to change this. And while he does technically betray those he was working alongside with, it's obvious that A, they were bad company, B, they were honorable company, and C, they never seem to really respect or value him as a person, like say Kanbei does. This kind of nullifies the bad taste of betrayal, especially after we see Kikuchiyo save his old boss Amaro, proving that he does indeed have a moral compass, and isn't just someone who would sell out the team when it seems convenient for him, or when it would serve his interest alone. Anyways, from this point on, Kikuchiyo can now be considered a new man of sorts, as he is now living under his own decisions and judgment. While he does subordinate himself to Kanbei, he does this out of respect for both Kanbei and the team. And more importantly, he is the one deciding that he will do that. While he doesn't change much as a character, we can see that he's genuinely happy and grateful for the team allowing him to, quote, try living. We know this not only from his dedication to his team and the countless extremely risky situations he puts himself in for them, but also because of the scant dialogue he does have, which does touch on this. Most important to prove this are his first and final words as a member of the Seven Samurai. His first words, of course, are his reasoning for switching sides, and those being, I thought I would try living. That he wants to try living shows that this is a man who feels as though he's been held down by the routine and boorish nature of his previous life. That this is a man who finally wants to take his own destiny into his own hands, and he's grateful for the team for allowing him to do that. As now as a member of the team, he has much more flexibility and is much more valued as a person. He has been given freedom from the old system which seemed to hold him in place simply as a tool or a attack dog of sorts. His final words are, "I will wait for you on the other side, Kanbei," or something along these lines. I don't remember them exactly. The important thing, though, is that these words, and the fact that he doesn't mention any regrets and dies with a smile, imply he has definitely found some sort of happiness. He has finally experienced living, and is genuinely grateful to the team for that fact. He's genuinely grateful that this group of people came along and allowed him to join them on his own accord, and that they allowed him to flourish in his own ways and along with his own ideas. He really does have no regrets, and that he does stand by his decision to join the Seven Samurai and try living for himself, as he's genuinely grateful for it. Even if he remains aloof and distant throughout the series, it is still clear he has found some sort of enjoyment out of living thanks to the Seven Samurai. He has found some enjoyment out of trying to live, as now, Kyuzo went from a man simply under the guidance and instructions and orders of a group of people that didn't care to him, to a man who could now decide things for himself. And as such, he decided to leave a bad situation, and decided to live for himself, and decided to see what he would like to do. As such, he decided to join this team on their great quest, and was happy for it, as he could finally be himself, and explore himself in his own ways. He was happy that he simply decided to try living. And trying living is a very important thing to do in this series and in the real world. In fact, it's kind of an underlying theme of the series, as we see that not trying living, or not quite getting a good grip on your life situation, can often lead to tragic circumstances, arguably most illustrated by the arguable main character of the series, Kanbei. Now, Kanbei is fascinating not only because he is the moral pillar of the group and arguably the most centralizing member of the Seven, but also because of the dichotomy within him. This is a dichotomy of a healthy and strong moral compass willing to stand for those who need help, but also of a somewhat prevalent nihilism or defeatism that lurks within his soul. He's an extremely jaded man who, while doing the right thing, does it more for logical reasons than any real emotional impetus that he has lost long ago. He doesn't really feel anything, and as such is someone who can't really even try living anymore because he has been so jaded by ramifications of naive decisions he made long ago in his youth. He is therefore a very tragic character in some ways, and yet also a very inspirational one, as in spite of these jaded edges to him, he still manages to be an honorable warrior, and he still manages to be a paragon of samurai virtue. Now, usually I save the most important characters for the last video in these series. However, as this is the 50th video on the channel, and as Samurai 7 is an ensemble piece with no true main character, I have decided to place Kanbei here, as he's probably the most three-dimensional character in the entire series. Now, Kanbei is introduced in episode 1, as a loner who, while extremely skilled in the ways of the samurai, and obviously attached to them, comes off as aloof, and perhaps a bit sad. He initially refuses to take part in the kind of village operation, stating that he's tired of fighting losing battles, and that he himself is a loser. He doesn't seem to care that much about the village initially, and only joins after Kiara kind of forces him to rescue her by jumping from a great height. After this encounter, Kanbei appreciates the boldness of the group and joins in. As the only members of the group by this point are Katsushiro, who immediately requests to become Kanbei's student, and Kikuchiyo, who is frankly unqualified by this point, Kanbei immediately falls into the role as the leader of the group. He even allows Kikuchiyo to stay, and begrudgingly takes on Katsushiro as a student, a process which we will examine a bit more in a bit. He makes plans to get a total of 7 samurai and fortify the village. As the group recruits more samurai, gets into fights, and eventually escapes the city, he is always with them at the helm to see that the mission is accomplished. He even accepts a new mission along the way, pledging to rescue the captive women once the defense of the Kana village is complete. Once everyone is gathered at the village, Kanbei retains his position as leader and successfully sees the village defended. Seeing the death of Gorobei, however, Kanbei seems dismayed by another loss and wanders off on his own to rescue the captive women. This sees him confess to a crime he didn't commit so that he can get an audience with the Emperor and stab him. Attempt to stab him. He doesn't succeed and is caught, only to be set to be executed. He is spared, however, due to Ukyo's machinations, and then rejoins and reforms the group after Katsushiro leaves in anger to take the capital. This mission is set up to be a sort of final hurrah, a death ride of sorts that will be, no matter what the outcome, his final battle. The mission, of course, is successful, and Kanbei survives, but again laments the loss of friends, and thus another losing battle. This leads us to analyzing Kanbei's character, and this one is quite layered, with many different aspects, all somewhat centered on the internal conflict of his between the ideals of being a warrior and the realities of such. He is the embodiment of the issues that arise when an idealistic individual meets the grim realities of the world we live in. We can see this both with his seemingly detached attitude, and yet the very developed moral compass he never seems to stray from. He is a character who is defined by the conflict of his brain and his heart. He is a man who wants to do the best, but knows that realistically it won't always help everyone, and or still come at a great cost. His heart tells him to exercise justice and righteous actions for the greater good, while his brain tells him that doing so realistically won't benefit him or fundamentally change the world. His heart tells him to use his great skills for good, while his brain tells him that no matter how skilled one man is, one man can only do so much. His heart tells him to empathize and take care of those around him, while his brain tells him empathy won't save the dead, and that strong attachment could even impair his judgment and hold him back. His heart tells him to feel no matter what is rational, and his brain tells him to think regardless of how he feels. And this sets the stage for a flawed man, and his character development. Kanbei is smart enough to know that unfettered idealism will inevitably only lead to disappointment and folly. However, he's smart enough to know that a moral compass is still needed to live a good life, even if there isn't too much feeling behind it anymore. To balance these two factors and maintain his identity, Kanbei has in a way made his moral compass into a sort of objective list by which he strives to live by and stay on course. His moral compass has petrified into a sturdy rock, which survives and guides him, even after the idealism and happiness that birthed it seemingly died long ago. This lets him balance between his brain and his heart to create a sort of passable zen mid-ground. As such, he is never a bleeding heart held back by emotions, but he isn't a heartless psychopath either, even if he does come off as cold from time to time. Now I say passable because Kanbei is not a happy man. Arguably, he may never achieve happiness by this point in life. No, instead he is a man who wants to feel, but has felt so much by this point in time that he realistically can't be bothered to consistently or strongly feel a majority of the time. He is, in a word, jaded. And while a good man, is also a man who has subconsciously learned to just let go of negativity instead of letting it fester. While this sounds good on paper, it's only possible because he's grown so numb to the world and his own emotions. He's aware that many things that will happen are out of his control, and that at this point it's not worth getting worked up over. He realizes that, and unfortunately also, that he will probably be like this for the rest of his life. He knows this though, and while showing some emotions from time to time, even having emotional outbursts, he for the most part just maintains a sort of mid-ground, which, though seemingly unsatisfying, is probably the best of some bad options. If he became completely emotional, he would probably have given in to despair or violent impulses by this point. If he had been completely rational, he would probably become an objectively bad person, as this would lead him to discard his moral compass and live by no true morals at all. However, he does have this middle option, and for this reason, in spite of his inner conflict, he always seems in control of himself. While he never seems too happy or sad or emotionally involved, he never gives in to despair or seems mad outside of select, usually justified moments, which seem to specifically trigger him. In fact, his emotions usually fall between mild amusement, mild irritation, and mild disappointment. Again, while some may argue this leads to the whole Kanbei is a psychopath argument, it really just conveys that he is a man with a good deal of emotional strength, emotional control, and that he's also extremely jaded. This is a man who's basically staked everything for his lifestyle and ideals, and it's clear that he's had to pay many tolls to do so. His many experiences have jaded him to the world, however it's also given him knowledge of the world, and illustrate to him the need to remain calm and in control of himself. It's not that he can't emote at all, and that it's not that he refrains from emoting because he's so in control of himself and knows he needs to remain calm. No, instead it's a combination of these two. An inner calm insulated by years of apathy brought upon by loss and emotional experiences. I mean, just think of it for a bit. Kanbei's ideals point to a man who at some point was probably idealistic and excited. We see that even though he's jaded to this day, his moral compass is still present, and this points to a man who believes in the codes of honors that idealized warriors are supposed to stick to. He believes in the righteousness of combat from time to time, or at least he used to. It seems he doesn't anymore. However, this is a man who, while naive at that point, ended up going to war nonetheless, where he experienced great losses in both friends, property, and personal self, and he found no real honor in death or killing. He found that his ideals did not insulate him from the grim ways of the world. However, they did prevent him from sinking too deep into the grim ways of the world. As such, he returned from war, a very jaded and different man, and, having been on the losing side, he finds himself returning to a totally different society, eager to leave relics like him in the past, regardless of his own accomplishments or conduct. With no real purpose now, all he has left are the set of ideals and lifestyle which got him here in the first place. He is left alone to stew in an apathetic world, with no real support or goal. Anyone would probably be at least a little dejected in this case if they put all they had into a set of ideals or tasks or lifestyle, only to be written off in the end for things outside of their control. And this explains why Kanbei is sort of a tragic samurai character, a character who, while exercising the ideals of a romanticized past, lives in a brutal and grim future. A man who, while noble in his own cause, is surrounded by unnoble people in an unnoble world, and is left to navigate these things on his own in a way which he can never do completely satisfactorily. This is a man who is a relic of the past, barely eking out a present. This tragic nature of sorts also, though, benefits him in an odd way, in that it allows him to see the ways of the world, and his jadedness allows him to be completely open about it. He realizes that sometimes living requires us to pull back from our emotions and analyze situations rationally. We see this as one of the most important lessons he teaches a young Katsushiro. Now, Katsushiro's relationship with Kanbei is one of the most developed in the series, and arguably the most important. In it, Kanbei serves as a mentor and pseudo-father figure to Katsushiro, who in turn serves as an enthusiastic student and later a sort of rebellious son. This dynamic serves to greatly develop both characters, and in return allows insight into Kanbei's heart and mind. It opens up a discussion to ask if Kanbei is actually a good mentor or not, and asks us to leave why he takes the approaches he does. To do this, let's first establish some important events in this mentorship. Highlighted in my mind's eye are Kanbei's initial refusal and then acceptance to teach Katsushiro, Kanbei's talk with Katsushiro after Katsushiro's first kill, Kanbei refusing to take Katsushiro with him to rescue the captive women, Katsushiro's break with Kanbei afterwards, and the two's reconciliation accumulating with Katsushiro's graduation. While we won't dissect any of these scenes, as each could honestly have their own video, they're very well composed, I just want to put these down to kind of jot your memory to see where we're coming from, as I will proceed to reference them from this point. First of all, let's talk about how Kanbei straight up refuses Katsushiro's request for a mentorship. This sort of establishes Kanbei as a man who doesn't want to take students. Now, while this may seem to make him rude, or isolated, or selfish, he really only does this because he doesn't want Katsushiro to experience the kind of things that he does. He's telling him, don't sign up for this. It's not as good as you think it might be. And this does show that Kanbei is capable of empathy, and in fact does empathize with his student a great deal. In fact, his tenure as Katsushiro's trainer proved that he is very empathetic towards him and probably sees himself in him. While many of his statements or actions may seem cold or harsh in a vacuum, when taken in the context and factored in together, they show that Kanbei is a man who is genuinely trying to help a youth in his own way. He just doesn't quite necessarily know the right way each time, as he's extremely jaded and allows the grim realities of the world to bog down Katsushiro's training from time to time. In a way, he allows this on purpose, as he doesn't necessarily want Katsushiro to be a samurai. He knows that the world isn't fair, and that even the greatest man can still be downtrodden. He knows the pain of loss and isolation, and as someone who has staked everything on being a samurai, he knows that being a samurai can take everything from one. He knows that Katsushiro isn't quite aware of what he signed up for, and he knows that Katsushiro is too naive and unskilled to succeed on his own. He knows all of these facts and pains, and in fact kinda wants to deter Katsushiro because he doesn't want Katsushiro to make the same mistakes he has. Although once Katsushiro resolves to do this, Kanbei decides that if he's gonna do it, he might as well do it right, and thus resolves to take Katsushiro as a student to help him navigate the world as successfully as he can. Again, he only decides to do this after Katsushiro seems resolute. He wants to make sure Katsushiro is resolute because he doesn't want Katsushiro to end up like him, a jaded loner with no real goal in mind, for no reason. He sees himself in Katsushiro, and we can see this in many of the more tender scenes, for example when Kanbei sharpens Katsushiro's blade. While this did come after he struck him, it is a poignant scene which lets us know that Kanbei was trying to teach Katsushiro a lesson, even if in not necessarily the best way. He never strikes Katsushiro out of pure rage or disappointment, but seems to do so out of a triggered rage to sort of blunt both of them out of an emotional stupor. Now, while this is obvious with Katsushiro, for Kanbei it's less obvious, although I think it can be said that Katsushiro's distresses distress Kanbei, as Kanbei can empathize with a young man who is going through some great pains, as Kanbei probably did when he was going through his training. Also note that the scene is a softer moment. This shows that Kanbei kind of realizes, or at least sort of realizes, that Katsushiro needs emotional support in addition to basic training and toughening up in order to be a samurai that he wants to succeed. I would like to note that while Kanbei does have moments of anger directed at Katsushiro, they usually are sometime around a softer scene, when Kanbei never apologizes to him, but at least says some kind of lesson. Again, take the blade sharpening scene, where after getting into their little spout, Kanbei shows that he does care for Katsushiro by sharpening his blade and returning it to him. He never holds on to his anger with his student, and can even be seen as extremely forgiving and understanding at certain moments. When Katsushiro kills Kyuzo in friendly fire, for example, Kanbei plainly accepts the reality of the ground and pushes the group along. Katsushiro is extremely distraught, as he should be, but Kanbei doesn't really let the fact hold him back. Instead, he looks at it objectively and sees friendly fire as the tragedy it is, but doesn't judge him or Katsushiro any more harshly than necessary. He simply says that Katsushiro acted with the best intentions in his mind, and therefore he can't necessarily hold it against him. Kanbei does in fact care for Katsushiro, and does throughout the series show some kind of empathy for a young man whom he hopes doesn't end up like him. None of this is to say that Kanbei is a perfect man or teacher or father figure, but instead that he is for the most part trying, or at least trying to prevent Katsushiro from becoming the man Kanbei is today. And this is what I meant when I said Kanbei maintains a steady approach regardless of tone. That approach is that Katsushiro is naive and barely trained, and that if I don't do something about it, he's either going to die a painful death or end up like me, living a painful life. The idea of someone ending up like Kanbei seems to greatly sadden him, and this explains why Katsushiro's distress or issues trigger Kanbei specifically, as it makes a usually calm man outburst in either anger or frustration. He's probably not necessarily angry or frustrated at Katsushiro, but the fact that Katsushiro had to go through such pain, and that Kanbei himself went through such pain. It's kind of picking at an old wound, the old wounds that he's grown numb to. It explains the fluctuations in tone and intensity, as Kanbei seems bothered by the idea that a youth he was once like can mature into the adult he currently is. One can pass their own judgment on whether or not they think Kanbei is a good mentor. That's up to you. But I think the assessment here is that he's a flawed man, and that his flaws as a man seep into his performance as a teacher, for better and worse. They lead him to try and toughen up Katsushiro in some ways that may or may not be the best, as he simply doesn't want Katsushiro to live as tragic a life as him. This is ironic, as Kanbei's desire to prevent Katsushiro from becoming jaded can show him at his most jaded. He doesn't want to feel the pain of losing control and the despair of years of loss. Kanbei knows that there's no honor in death, and seems to believe that the only true victory is a battle avoided. He believes in the precious nature of life, and is always eager to forgive, despite how jaded he is. All of this eagerness shows that Kanbei is a man who at least is trying to keep moving forward. While his character is tragic, I appreciate how the show handles this. The story never really dwells on how much pain he's in or how messed up his life is, but instead on what he's doing about it now, and how he continues to develop. I like the approach of the show because of how open it is. While Kanbei is not an open character, and has a great deal of nuance to him, he's honest to himself and the viewer. He walks in jaded, he shows that he's very jaded, and yet he still tries to help anyways, because he knows it's the right thing to do. He is a flawed man, and a strong man, and in a way these two kind of buttress each other to make a very memorable and enduring character. This is a character who shows the true breadth of the human experience, as someone who can do both very noble acts and is very skilled, and yet is also flawed in his own ways, and not necessarily in touch with his own emotions. It is a man who, while accomplishing great deeds, is still somewhat tragic, but a tragic character who can still accomplish great deeds. It is a man who can go off on his own and to do his own thing, but can also interact greatly in groups and bring people together, even if he himself has lost the connectivity that many of us may now have. He's a man who, while numb, has kind of forced himself to feel in some cases, and has allowed himself to always follow the path of righteousness, even when he himself doesn't necessarily benefit from it. He is the pinnacle of the melancholic and lonely samurai, going off into a futile mission to make sure that he does what is best. In fact, the kind of death ride summarizes it, as Kanbei has kind of like come to an acceptance of sorts, as he just gives in to the idea of a final mission with no plan, going in guns a-blazing. He comes to a sort of peace with himself, that even if he is a loser, he is a righteous loser. We can see this in the final scene at Katsushiro's graduation, when Kanbei finally is at terms with himself and what he's done, giving up the way of the blade to pass on to a new generation who, for some reason, wants it, in this case Katsushiro. While Kanbei does lament the loss of his friends and another losing battle, he has seemed to come to terms with at least himself to some bit, and has seemed to have found himself to an extent as well. He is a man who, aware of the fact that he will never completely fix himself, has learned to be satisfied, or at least content with what he has now. He is a man who has upheld the noble warrior ideals he seeks to live by, even if he has become bogged down in the grim realities of the world. On these grim realities of the world, it's interesting how they also form a core part of his student's character development, that is Katsushiro. Now Katsushiro starts off as a naive young man who wants to be a samurai and aspires to be everything that they are on the box. Honorable warriors who always fight virtuous battles for those who need it, and rise to every occasion. However, the grim realities mentioned previously start to set in as his first battles, as his first kills, as his first defeats and grievous blows tell him that battle is not something which should be worshipped, but instead a grim facet of the world that sometimes cannot be helped. And in a way, Katsushiro kinda even becomes Kanbei's last stand, as Kanbei strives to teach a man the skills that he has without necessarily imprinting onto him all of the jaded coldness that he has. He does imprint on him the realities of the world and how things operate. However, he doesn't want Katsushiro to be traumatized to the point that he has, as he sees Katsushiro's pursuit of this path in the first place as something of a mistake, of something of a tragedy. And walking this path, and how he and his teacher navigated, are key pillars of Katsushiro's character development, and really create an interesting character, as while he is one that is arguably somewhat useless, he doesn't really do that much in terms of plot development. In terms of imparting the theme of the series, that is the grim nature of battle, he is arguably the most important of the samurai, as we see it corrupt a young man. However, thanks to Kanbei, he is not completely destroyed by it. And that leads us into a talk about Katsushiro's main character and his development. Now, Katsushiro is the samurai which probably grows the most in the series, and can be argued as one of the main characters. I will refrain from saying the main character, since as an ensemble piece, this series doesn't really have one, but he's definitely the character that grows the most, and gets quite a bit of screen time. His evolution is a fascinating one, and for that reason will be the subject of this video. As always though, let's start with some context. Now Katsushiro introduces himself in the very first episode of the series, as he stops a thief from stealing the rice that Kiara and company bring to the city. He is immediately thanked and agrees to go with them to help defend Kana village from the bandits. In spite of his strong introduction though, and his extreme fixation with samurai ideals, he soon proves to be a bit inexperienced though, and once Kanbei joins the team, subordinates himself to him as a student. From here, Katsushiro acts as something of a personal guard for Kiara, often accompanying her and protecting her, sometimes more successfully than others. Over time, though, the two seem to grow romantically attached to each other, and this begins an odd will-they-won't-they relationship, which kinda just stays in the background of the series the whole time, but is definitely impactful of it. Before this relationship goes too far, though, the group of course has to leave the city, and of course Katsushiro is part of this. By this point, he is engaged in multiple fights with varying levels of success, and has learned quite a bit. In the caves, he's put out of commission for a bit by a dart which hits him in the leg, although this soon proves to be a boon, as it means he can successfully act as a reserve force of sorts and rescue Kikuchiyo and help win the battle in the desert. Once the group makes it to Kana, Katsushiro serves as a sentry, and even kills an enemy scout. This is his first kill in combat, and it greatly shakes him, although with Kanbei and Kiara's help, he overcomes this, and eventually goes on to successfully contribute to the defense of the village. He has survived his first major battles and even witnessed the death of a compatriot, having seen Gorobei die in his very arms. Still resolute to be a samurai though, he hopes to accompany Kanbei in his quest to rescue the women, although is disappointed and hurt when Kanbei leaves him behind to go off on his own. Eventually though, he still resolves to help Kanbei in any way he can, and takes part in a futile attempt to rescue him. Although again, this should be noted as futile, as Kanbei proves capable of handling himself, and Ukyo cancels the execution anyways. The two are reunited, however, and this sees Katsushiro go off on Kanbei, for the latter's lack of faith in his student. This tirade sees Kanbei discipline Katsushiro, and Kiara even go up and slap him. Now mad, Katsushiro decides to go off on his own, to Kana, to defend it on his own and do his own thing. Before doing this though, he has an awkward kiss scene with Kiara in some back alley, and the two are basically destined to be separate by this point. This sees Katsushiro go off on his own, back to Kana village to defend it from further bandit attacks. Along the way, he kinda grows as a person, being on this sort of pseudo-vision quest, even seeing a ghost of Gorobei, who helps guide him back to both the village and his own samurai ideals. Now arriving in Kana, Katsushiro's solo performance again turns out to be something of a boon, as he's the only one around to defend it from the first waves of attacks that the capital has directed against Kana village. From here, he kinda actually takes over the defense of Kana village, setting up lines and helping the villagers remember how to defend themselves. He sets up a good line and defends Kana village from the capital before the rest of the samurai arrive to attack it from behind. He joins the main group as they do so, and although accidentally killing Kyuzo, proves his overall importance and skill, as he is one of only 3 survivors. In his final scenes in the story, we see him train and winter in Kana, as Kiara approaches him one last time, as he reflects upon the graves of his fallen companions. She comes on to him again, however he refuses her, and having learned much under Kanbei, proclaims that he finally understands what it's like to be a samurai. He's finally sure of himself and his path, and having walked up upon the scene by this point, Kanbei now walks up to him and gives him his sword in recognition of him and his skill as a fellow warrior. Katsushiro gratefully accepts this, and thus walks off into the night on his own path, to begin his own tale. With this context elaborated upon, let's explore Katsushiro's character and development. Of all the characters, Katsushiro probably develops the most. In the beginning, he's a naive young boy, borderline incompetent, and lost in his ideals. He thinks that the proclamation of noble ideals will somehow be enough to get him through life, and that it'll shield him from all the tough parts of it. In the end, he is a competent warrior, hardened by many battles, and who has learned much about the world and himself. He is now confident and able to walk on his own. To examine this process and how he got from point A to point B, let's examine his growth as a warrior, his growth as a thinker, and his growth as a person. Now as a warrior, Katsushiro's growth is the most obvious. His martial skills greatly improve, and he even shows himself to be a decent commander when the occasion calls for it. Early on, Katsushiro gets bodied quite often, and while good at holding Kiara's hand, admittedly doesn't seem too good for too much else as the series begins. He has a habit of bungling jumps, which I consider a clever display of inexperience by the production team, and his techniques lack a lot of the refined grace we see exercised by the more skilled veterans. Instead, his sword techniques tend to reflect the primal fear and fury within him, as we see him recklessly sling his sword about in a sort of primal fear and rage. Again, this reflects on his inexperience, as he hasn't quite learned to control himself or his emotions in the midst of combat. However, from the start, it's evident that Katsushiro's techniques, even if unrefined and bungled, show a lot of heart, and this gives him a good base to work from. While he still lacks a great deal of grace by the final episode, he's definitely competent now, and has become an objectively better fighter, even borderline good. But, under all this skill development lies a deeper core of mental development. As the series progresses, we see Katsushiro go from a naive young lad, blindly following and attached to his ideals, to a man who knows the way of the world and can truly appreciate what it means to be a samurai. The critical watershed in this is when Katsushiro takes his first kill. While beforehand he proclaims the brave nature and necessity of combat, he had never actually done much of it before, and never actually killed someone doing it. Doing so finally shows him the grim nature of the world, and the fact that his ideals will not shield him. While he did do it for a noble cause, he still killed someone, and thus committed an unnoble act. This opens up Katsushiro's eyes to the magnitude of what he signed up for, the magnitude of his life decisions and where he's at the moment, and the magnitude of his path ahead of him. He finally internalizes that his ideals are not always enough to get him through life, and that no matter what he does and no matter how morally he tries to live, there will always be some dirt on his hands no matter what he does. Initially, Katsushiro is very distraught at this revolution, and is only kind of helped out of it by Kanbei and Kiara. From here, Katsushiro starts to accept the facts on the ground and grow into his own self, as he matures and learns to apply his ideals to the world as much as he can, but slowly accepts the fact that they will not be enough to get him through on their own, and that there are situations where his ideals might be compromised. While he does get a little jaded from time to time, though, his maturation is for the most part good, and he does so a great deal. And this leads to his innermost development, his development as a person. Now Katsushiro's tale is a coming of age of sorts. He goes from a boy with a vision to a man with learning. Most notably, he becomes a man who can stand on his own. In the beginning, it's obvious that Katsushiro hasn't quite cemented who he is as a person. His identity is still coming together, and he is a young man finding himself, and trying to answer who he really is at his core, who he is as a person. This explains his obsession with samurai ideals, as they serve as a starting point, something to define him and guide him and help form himself, a sort of template if you will. To further his guidance and growth, Katsushiro assigns himself to a teacher, Kanbei, and even plays into a sort of pseudo-romance of sorts, the one he has with Kiara. Now, these are acts of an insecure young man looking for support and purpose in order to shore up his own identity. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Nope, I see no issue with someone looking to someone else for advice or guidance if they themselves are uncomfortable in their current situation. No one is born the person they are at 40, and instead gets there over time, via many layers of personal growth, personal experiences, and personal interactions with those around them. No one gets there alone either. And everyone, at least to some extent, is shaped by someone else for better and worse. Katsushiro serves as a very good, realistic model of someone growing over time and being shaped by those around him and the circumstances around him. He isn't some idealized youth who's great at everything right off the bat, and he isn't some complete downer who hates everything. No, instead he's a young man who, while wanting to do the best and be the best version of himself, is aware that he's not necessarily that good yet and isn't even quite sure of who he is yet. It's a very realistic example in this sense, and is a great example of how someone can be helped by those around them to discover themselves, and thus discover the world and be able to stand more on their own, more independent of both their ideals and others. Now this process of course takes the entire series and begins with Katsushiro divorcing his rose-tinted glasses on the samurai ideals and the world. Katsushiro himself inadvertently kicks this process off by joining up with the team in the first place, and both Kanbei and Kiara support him through it in their own ways. The support they offer allows Katsushiro to accept the realities of the world and how they conflict with his views, as opposed to outright rejecting his initial views. This means that Katsushiro can learn without becoming completely jaded, and that he can develop without completely abandoning who he was in the beginning. And as he learns more of himself, and his independence grows as well as his world experiences shape him. Another key experience I would like to note on to support this is Katsushiro learning how harsh life can be, and this is best exemplified by his failure to rescue Kanbei. While him and Kikuchiyo try very hard to, and it's obvious that they're very personally invested in this endeavor, it's also obvious that had they been the only option to rescue Kanbei, and Kanbei couldn't handle himself, Kanbei would probably be dead by episode 20. I note this because failure is a great motivator and teacher, and in this case, Katsushiro learns the need to up his game. He sees his failure and reflects upon it, and this both drives him to become a better samurai and become a better independently functional person. He realizes that while those around him supporting him is great, he needs to be able to support them in turn, and that he needs to be able to do so on his own, should the circumstances require it, in order to support those around him, in order to make sure that he can be the strongest and best possible teammate possible. And of course this applies to all of us as well, as the stronger we are as individuals, the better we can support those around us. And while Kiara does show her support for this endeavor, Katsushiro's failure means that he doesn't really have much to show Kanbei in the end, and this helps kick off the spat which sees the two separate, and sees Katsushiro leave the group, and kind of Kiara from this point. Now, quick note on the romance aspect of Katsushiro's character. While this aspect does seem a bit awkward at times and undercooked, it's sort of always there in the background. It's never unrealistic or completely negative either. Instead, again, I'd like to note Katsushiro's character aspect here as something of a very realistic and therefore genuine approach to this kind of thing. It's an awkward romance that two youths form because they seem to like each other and have their best intentions in mind. They want to support someone that they like, even if that attraction doesn't have the most concrete foundation. Instead, this is a genuine and accurate representation of two well-meaning but naive people trying to help each other and things simply falling through. While it is often a little cooked and kind of pierces the story in odd places, it is consistent enough where it doesn't come off as tacky, and the two genuinely seem to learn and care about each other. They seem to benefit from each other as well, and take a lot of comfort in each other's support when they do give it. Katsushiro is given a sort of goal and validation, and definitely emotional support, while Kiara seems to get something like that in return, in addition to some validation for getting the samurai on board in the first place. She doesn't feel as bad about it because Katsushiro's growth makes it obvious that they all signed up for this voluntarily. And while the two do separate, the fact that they part amicably in the end is also another sign of growth, as it means that they are mature enough and have grown enough to respect each other and move on. Anyways, as Katsushiro learns to stand on his own, his identity starts to crystallize into his true adult form, his final form as you will. This creates a new sense of independence, and the second step of becoming his final form, no longer requiring validation from others. That's not to say Katsushiro doesn't appreciate validation from others, and it's definitely not to say he becomes a sort of heartless Sigma male, but instead he realizes that he doesn't need approval from others to feel good about who he is as a person. He can be confident in himself, and that he doesn't need the validation of others to do so. This newfound independence, however, helps explain his rebellious streak later on in the series. Although by this point he's confident in himself enough, and realizes the gravity of the situation enough to the point where he doesn't overcorrect. He's now confident in himself, and confident in that he can be a good team member, which he does do in the final battle. But he doesn't isolate himself, he doesn't cut himself off, and he doesn't abandon the team completely. It's just that finally, having been through all of this, and growing enough, he's grown to the point where he now understands his own path, and who he is as a person, and how to move on. He understands how to be a strong individual, and therefore help contribute to a strong team. He's confident of who he is, and no longer seeks the validation from social norms or from others, as he so sought from Kanbei, Kiara, and even Kuzo at times. No, instead now, he is his own man, with his own identity. This is confirmed by him going off on his own quest in the final episode. He's his own person now, and no longer needs validation from others, or his original naive ideals. Instead, he can now seek validation from his own set of ideals which he's crafted and shaped over the course of this series, a set of ideals which is more realistic and applicable than the naive ones he started with. Instead, now, he can seek validation from himself, and his own ideals, and his own quest, and his own person. And, in fact, this seeking of validation gives him a unique parallel to another sort of pseudo-samurai of Samurai 7, which is Kikuchiyo. Like Katsushiro, Kikuchiyo is not technically a samurai by the beginning of the series, although he kind of earns this rank as the story progresses. However, unlike Katsushiro, who has to learn who he is and what he wants and how he wants to validate himself, Kikuchiyo kind of already knows these things, but works outside of established frameworks in order to do so. He knows that he wants to be an honorable warrior who helps the peasants. However, he's not really able to do so on his own, and it's only him joining the group which facilitates this goal of his. He is a very unique and out-of-the-box character, as one who is not technically a samurai, and as one who is technically not even mostly human. He does seem to be mostly mechanical. However, that doesn't mean that he doesn't have a human soul, and it doesn't mean that he doesn't have spirit, as his ample showings of both of these and his ample morality prove that he is an honorable warrior and worthy of finally ascribing to being a quote-unquote official samurai. As the beating and bleeding heart of the group, he lends a very important humanizing element to it as well, which is again kind of ironic seeing as that he is the most mechanical of all the samurai. And like Katsushiro and Kanbei, can be considered among the main cast of the series. He does a lot and says a lot more, so let's start with some context. Now Kikuchiyo is introduced in episode 1, proclaiming himself to be a great and powerful samurai, certainly carrying himself as one, although it is shown by Kanbei that this is something of a boisterous lie, and even Kiara doubts his worth. This doesn't deter Kamachi though, who, seeing a big samurai, decides to go for it, and decides to recruit him. In turn, Kikuchiyo, feeling honored by someone finally acknowledging him as samurai, decides to go along with no real convincing. He gladly joins the team, and from this point on is glued to it. From here, he goes about with the group fighting, exploring, and recruiting in the city. Even after Kanbei joins, and specifically tells Kikuchiyo to leave as he isn't a real samurai, Kikuchiyo stays on, determined to prove himself. While separated during the city escape and presumed dead, he is in fact fine, and his durability becomes a theme throughout the series. He rejoins the group in the caves only to be captured by opposing forces, although he's quickly rescued and proceeds to the group with Kana. It is in Kana where Kikuchiyo has his most important character moment, however, as he talks to the villagers gathered before Gonzo because of Gonzo's betrayal. In this tense scene of division, Kikuchiyo galvanizes the group by telling them about himself and his background. As someone who is both samurai and farmer, he can understand both sides, but he convinces both sides of the need to work together for the greater good. In this speech, he reveals who he is as a person, as someone who is not a mechanical samurai, as someone who deeply wants to help the farmers simply for the sake of it. He wants to help everyone do the best that they can. He unites everyone and sets the stage for Kanbei to assume the role of a unified commander. In the actual defense of the village, Kikuchiyo proves to be quite a competent member of the team as well, and helps win the battles. Afterwards, having been left behind by Kanbei, Kikuchiyo convinces Katsushiro to join up with him to go after Kanbei and support him anyways. Again, this quest inevitably proves to be a failure that doesn't accomplish much of anything, but Kikuchiyo is glad nonetheless that Kanbei is okay, and rejoins him for the final assault on the capital. In this assault, Kikuchiyo proves to be a skilled warrior, and his farmer background even proves helpful in literally sniffing out the real emperor. He does, however, take a beating, and unlike previous occasions, he does unfortunately not make it out alive. His final act is wielding a giant sword to literally bat the capital away from Kana village, and thus save it. With Kikuchiyo's role examined, let's look at his character. With his introduction, Kikuchiyo initially comes off as a belligerent and arrogant man, who works solely for glory and himself. No one really seems to take him too seriously, and it could be speculated that he only really accepts his task for recognition. He goes on to disprove these negative first impressions though, and to establish himself as a genuine team player. While it may seem he initially accepts the mission simply to chase glory, it doesn't seem to be this case at the end of the story, as it really seems that above all he simply wants the acceptance of those around him, and to help them as well. This need for acceptance, of course, is linked to his questionable samurai status. The idea that Kikuchiyo may not be a real samurai is cleverly hinted at from the beginning of the series, and established by the fact that he isn't fully human. This makes us a little weary of him, as the series has shown that the mechanical samurai are usually not the best people to hang around with. This leads us to suspect Kikuchiyo and his intentions when we first meet him. The writers cleverly subvert this though by showing us that our hunch isn't entirely untrue, as it is proven that he is not a true samurai. However, this isn't because he's a bandit or a bad man, but instead because he is a farmer seeking acceptance and to cement his new identity as a samurai. Of course, like any identity, acceptance and recognition are critical to it, and this also explains why Kikuchiyo is so eager to help. He wants to assert himself as a samurai to both himself and the community as a whole, and he wants to do this in order to overcome the obstacles of his past life and circumstances and help others do the same. He wants to use his new powers so that those around him don't have to suffer having no power like he has in the past. He craves acceptance not to seek glory, but instead to sustain his iron will to help those around him. In Katsushiro's video, I mentioned how supporting others in a team requires one to be able to support themselves. A strong team is made up of the strong contributions of strong individuals. And I mention this because Kikuchiyo seems to understand that facet of life, and for this reason seeks to augment his own strength as much as possible. He seeks strength not only for himself, but for the collective as well, in order to strengthen the team by strengthening himself. Now this does of course feed into his personality and skills, and of course not completely positively. It does contribute to his initial arrogance and boisterousness as he seeks to compensate for his lack of true samurai background or training, and well, he's definitely trying. He's arguably succeeding, faking it until he makes it. Faking it has a price though, and in this case it is a sense of reckless abandon and the accumulation of unneeded damage to both himself and his pride. Sometimes he bites off more than he can chew, and it's obvious that he's not necessarily the most skilled or doesn't necessarily have any real training. Because faking it accentuates his lack of formal training, he instead knows his strength and decides to lean on that excessively. As he doesn't necessarily know how to use it the best though, falling back on brute force often sees him take a lot of damage. He knows he's strong and confident, or at least that he needs to come off as these things, and so tends to overrate both his competence and durability. This explains many of his clownish acts and why he kind of becomes a sort of comic relief character throughout the series. In addition, as a result, the physically strongest member of the team is not necessarily the best member of the team, and is no stranger to getting manhandled or beaten back. None of this is to say that Kikuchiyo is a bad character, though. Instead, he is one which richly depicts the mind and heart of someone trying to rise above the circumstances of both their birth and look for acceptance in their new role that they have sought and made for themselves. His farmer background makes him uniquely relatable to the peasants he serves and allows him to serve as a sort of bridge between both them and the, quote, real samurai. I also find it fitting how he, a former peasant held down by the current system, is the one which lands the finishing blow on Ukyo, the man currently at the head of the system, and currently abusing it for personal gain. Kikuchiyo is a man of the people, and while he is a faker, he's also a team player, and grateful to the team. While he does initially come off as arrogant and hostile, once he finds the acceptance he has always sought, he shows himself to be extremely dedicated to the mission and those around him. We see this as his relationships with his fellow samurai evolve. He initially looks down on Katsushiro, is hostile towards Kanbei, dismisses Gorobei, threatens Heihachi, and mistrusts Kyuzo. Shichiroji is cool, I guess. But, as he fights alongside the team, he grows to trust and respect them, and soon begins to go out of his way to support and protect those around him, giving it his all, even the ultimate sacrifice. Kikuchiyo is an interesting character because he's simultaneously the most genuine and yet artificial of the samurai. It is fascinating how they juxtapose the genuine nature of his character and identity with the very artificial elements of his being and circumstances. On one hand, Kikuchiyo is a very genuine man. He wears his heart on his sleeve, and always tries to do his best, even if he's not the most capable or subtle. He isn't bothered by his lack of capabilities, but instead decides to constantly work on them, as he's aware of them, or at least seems to be sometimes. He never refrains from speaking his mind or interceding for others when he feels a need to. He is acutely aware of who he is, and while he grows friendlier over time to the group, he never fundamentally changes as a person. That's not to say he doesn't grow or develop, and this isn't an insult to his character, but instead to say that he is in touch with himself from the beginning of the plot. As a result, he can consistently be himself, and thus genuine in his ideals and actions to those around him. This genuine core, of course, juxtaposes his artificial exterior. On the surface level, almost everything about this guy is fake. He's not a real samurai, he's not always a real skilled fighter, and it can be argued he's not even a real dude. No. Instead, if we look at it from a factual point of view, it is fact that he's an artificial samurai living in an artificial body who exhibits fluctuating levels of skills throughout various fights, with some results better than others. He is a great pretender, who knowingly claims that he is things he's not. He, in a sense, is living a lie. However, this doesn't change who he is at his core, or who he is as a person, and why he's a good man. In the end, while many of his artificial traits are superficial, his genuine traits run deep, and therefore define him and his soul as genuinely helpful. Sure, he may not be a, quote, real man due to his robotic body, but he definitely has a real heart and a real soul. Sure, his skills are kinda inconsistent at times, but he can be really good in fights, and when needed, never runs away. And sure, he may not be a real samurai according to his birth and according to records, but he embodies the virtues that a real samurai should live by, and is thus accepted by the other samurai as one of their own. While he technically isn't a samurai, at the end, by living according to his own ideals and according to himself, and striving to be the best he can and help those around him, he has become samurai. Having discussed the seven samurai, it's time we discuss some non-samurai characters. And to start this process, I thought it fitting to start with the man at the head of the process. That, of course, is Ukyo. Now, Ukyo serves as the main antagonist of the series, although only does so after the sort of halfway point of the story, and he's also a neat commentary/examination on historical perspectives and on what makes a good ruler. He is simultaneously extremely narcissistic, spoiled, and selfish, a borderline sociopath in fact, but he's also incredibly cunning, charismatic, intelligent, and borderline competent. He's not crazy, but instead dangerously sane, and extremely well written as a man who will either stab you in the back or give you a nice pat on the back. You can't tell which he's gonna do, but he knows which one he's gonna do, and there's always a sort of method to his madness. Getting a tad personal for a moment, in the OAM annuals of Antagonist, he's probably the most intriguing in my eyes, at least so far, and one of my favorites. He's much more cunning than Big Al, much more pragmatic than Knives, and much more defined and fleshed out than Proxy 1. I mean, let's be honest, that guy was in like 5 minutes of footage. Anyways, as of now, he will hold the unofficial title of Best Bad, which is something I find even more impressive considering that Ukyo is an anime original character. Quite impressive, and one of the best original additions that the writers made to this version of the tale. Getting back to Ukyo's character, let's see what got him to this point, and why he's such an excellent exercise in writing. To begin, we will begin where we always do, with his context. Now, Ukyo is introduced in episode 1, as the son of the city ruler Amaro. Now, he initially just comes off as a spoiled brat, the son of the local magistrate who just wants to get what he wants at all times. In episode 2, that is Kiara, whom he proceeds to kidnap. This, of course, is foiled by the samurai, but Ukyo remains resolute in spite of initially being shaken up for a bit. At this point, most of us, including myself, will probably just see this guy as a 2-bit villain who will come up every now and again to make appearances and annoy us, but not really do much from that point on. Doesn't really strike us as the kind of guy to have much of an impact on the series. This, of course, is very wrong, and Ukyo eventually proves so. For now, though, he just kind of relaxes at home, though he does kill the Imperial Ambassador, though this isn't revealed until much later, and uses this as an excuse to round up the samurai of the city. This, of course, fleshes out our main protagonists, and allows him to catch up with them and Kiara for a fleeting moment in the caves. Though, of course, he's forced back once everyone reaches these caves, and once again just kind of goes home and does his own thing for a bit. It is here, though, that we start to see the inner workings of his mind and his Machiavellian processes. The first hint at this is when he decides to start a system of village protection emulating the Kana model by paying the unemployed samurai of the city to protect the various villages surrounding the city. This earns him a lot of respect and support from both some samurai and some peasants, and this cues us into the fact that Ukyo has plans, and maybe he is gonna actually do something. When Kanbei turns himself into the capital as part of his ploy to execute the current emperor, Ukyo of course wants to see this, and thus too ventures to the capital. It is here, though, that Ukyo gets his lucky break, and evolves from fringe menace to best bad. Here in the capital, 2 important things about Ukyo are revealed. 1. He is a clone of the current emperor, raised in a peasant village, and later adopted by Amaro as his own. And 2. He's extremely skilled and knowledgeable in both politics and court politics especially. These 2 things allow Ukyo to pass the tests assigned to him by the emperor, and thus be appointed to succeed the current emperor. He then fast-forwards this process by, pulling the plug on him. I mean, look at this smile. He's excited to become a leader. Anyways, now as the emperor, Ukyo goes about consolidating his power and reshaping the political order. A bit, more on that later. He starts by cementing his support among the unemployed samurai and the peasants by continuing to pay them to protect villages. This, of course, requires something to protect from, so he instructs the bandits to continue collecting tribute, or at least attempting to, and enjoys their suffering. It is revealed that he hates mechanical samurai due to having experienced their aggressiveness in the past as a peasant. Now at the peak of his prowess and prestige, Ukyo seeks to finalize his reign by destroying the one possible source of resistance to it, that being Kana Village. This of course results in the capital's attack on it, and ultimately his death. While the assault by the capital initially seems to go very well, he does underestimate the samurai, who of course get in to the capital, destroy the capital, and ultimately corner him. Although, like all smart rulers, he of course has several body doubles in place and an escape plan, although again underestimating the samurai, this too is foiled, and he is cleaved by Kanbei and gets punched by Kikuchiyo so he can get thrown into a canyon and die somewhere in its dirt. This of course is after he gets one last lunge at Kiara though, again being denied at the very end. With Ukyo's story explained, let's examine his character and why I think he's well written. Now, he's fascinating as he's probably the most realistic and dangerous kind of villain we've seen on this channel so far, the calculating and pragmatic kind. Someone who is criminally sane. While he is a narcissist and kinda goes a little mad with power, he's never unrealistic or impractical. Everything is at least somewhat calculated and serves some sort of purpose. He has his finger on the pulse of the people, and uses this to exercise a masterclass in manipulation and realpolitik. He realizes the power and societal structures present around him, and instead of trying to tear them down or greatly reshape them in his own image, he just kinda tweaks them a little bit to advance his own power as much as possible. We can see this in how he consolidates his position upon ascending to it. A less cunning leader would probably have simply just executed the bandits because, he hates them, but Ukyo instead punishes them by sending them on suicide missions, knowing that they will be beaten by the samurai he has hired to guard the villages. Now again, this might seem a tad silly, as he's essentially paying two opposing armies both loyal to him to fight each other to a possible death, but it does make sense upon further examination. This is brilliant because by playing off the different factions against each other, he weakens and destroys the ones he hates, the bandits, trains up the ones he doesn't mind, his samurai, and furthers his position to those who like him, the now employed samurai, and maybe some of the peasants who see him as slightly better than the last guy. This also reduces the chances of either side rebelling against him, as he has not gotten rid of the old machinery and social systems present in the old regime, but instead simply placed himself on top of them in order to keep everything running as smoothly as possible. He has simply put everything under new management, but hasn't actually changed anything being managed. As such, he can hit the ground running and pursue his goals relatively quickly. Another example of his cunning is the employment of his clone brothers. While they are clones of the same person and thus could try to usurp him, Ukyo intrinsically understands that they are too weak to do so, both physically and mentally. Thus, instead of trying to destroy a possible vestigial threat from the previous administration, he instead utilizes them as body doubles, providing a good service to him, and either co-opting or strong-arming possible contenders or pretenders to the throne to support his regime. Ukyo, above all, knows that there's no need to reinvent the wheel, and thus he never bothers doing so. He knows that all he has to do to consolidate himself and his position of power is be at least somewhat popular, show a modicum of generosity, weaken any possible contenders at least a little bit, and then just blame all the issues present on the previous administration. We can see this in his various acts of goodwill and other actions he takes. Now, I don't think Ukyo hates or even looks down on the peasants, as he used to be one of them, but at the same time, I don't buy into him being a sort of man of the people. He does understand them, though, and he uses various generous acts, which, let's be honest, to someone as rich as him doesn't really cost him anything, to win the peasants' support. He knows that he can simply buy his way out of certain issues, and sometimes that is the most practical thing to do. He does this when he gives rice to the urban poor, and when he releases the women held captive by the last emperor, and even grants Kanbei clemency. He is aware that he himself isn't very physically powerful, but he has a great many deal of resources which enable him to exercise power over others via the societal systems he now lords over. He therefore knows that he must retain the loyalty of others in order to retain their power, and that the systems present allow him the best chance at doing so. Therefore, even though he isn't a very generous or personable person at his core, he understands the need to look so and be so for, social purposes and ultimately serving himself. Again, none of this is really an issue for him because he does seem at least a little self-aware and he is very cunning, very knowledgeable on how to utilize systems like this. This doesn't necessarily scratch who he is as a person, though. As a person, Ukyo is also a bit interesting, although admittedly a tad shallow. He's an extremely competent and unconcerned ruler who simultaneously has some lingering fears, especially of mechanical samurai, and dislikes, again, especially of mechanical samurai, and he knows the need to act the way the peasants think he should. That is to say, he needs to know how to feign concern and compassion. He is proof that a good listener is often more in touch and more dangerous than a good talker. He, for the longest time, seems uninterested in ruling, in the people, and in anything other than himself. Thus, he gives us the image that he would be a horrible ruler, someone who is incompetent. He leads us in to believe the idea that he would be nothing more than a playboy who is incapable of ruling over an empire because he would be distracted by the riches provided for it. However, this is probably the exact opposite of the truth. Again, he's very in touch with the systems present and how to get the most out of them. As such, he knows how and when to turn on his natural charisma to further his own advances, and, if that doesn't work, he also knows the power of the threat of force, and that it can often be more effective than the force itself. He knows how to win others over as efficiently as possible, and he does so via a coercive mix of both rewards and threats. This isn't necessarily to say he's interested in ruling or that he's a, quote, good person, but that he knows how to rule over others as efficiently as possible in order to maximize how much time and how many resources he can devote to himself. Again, he is competent to further his own selfish desires. He does the right thing for the wrong reasons. Over the years, he's learned to become very good at this, and utilizes his words above all else to do so. In spite of words being his main outlet, though, Ukyo uses them as a tool, and this proves that he's an extremely pragmatic person. He doesn't hype himself or the country up much when he takes power, so much as he uses words to creep into the minds and hearts of those around him. Notice how many times he, as either a powerful magistrate or emperor, bows to others who are no doubt somewhere very far beneath him on the social ladder power ranking. He does this because he realizes that his own personal prestige doesn't provide too much in terms of physical force, and thus should be used as pragmatically as possible to win the physical support of others. What difference does bowing to someone really make to a guy like Ukyo when, in return for doing something that realistically costs him nothing, he wins the ample support and admiration of those under him, who he can realistically use and exploit? He's added practical value to his status by voluntarily lowering himself from it on occasion, and therefore seeming much more sympathetic or likable to those under him. This practical side in turn allows Ukyo to utilize his massive empire very efficiently, to pursue whatever he would like to do so, and this leads us to ask, is Ukyo a good ruler? Now, while this question may seem a bit irrelevant, because it is, Samurai 7 is based on 7 Samurai, which is a period piece, and this got me thinking as to whether or not Ukyo would be considered a good ruler if he was a real historical figure. I mean, think about it. If we look at his rule objectively, he consolidated his realm, he protected the peasants, he won favor among many of the poor and warrior classes, and he proved to be great at court politics. Had he been a real guy and governed for, say, I don't know, like 20 years, he would probably be remembered as a competent, maybe even decent ruler. Again, I bring this up not to say he's a good guy, he's definitely not, but instead to point out that he is competent, and that competent government does tend to benefit those under it. It means that someone can do the right things, even if for the wrong reasons. And it allows us to see how big-brained he can be when it comes to governing over those under him, even if he is still a scumbag. Again, in spite of all of the seeming praise I've given this man, I don't think he's a good person, though. He's simply an interesting political portrait of what realpolitik and manipulation can look like when utilized to its extreme in an environment without many checks or balances on said person. He is arrogant and selfish, and above all, highly manipulative. He is a borderline sociopath. I mean, just look at how he smiles when he assumes power. He's smiling because he knows he can get away with this, and that because of what he's about to acquire, he's going to be able to get away with a lot more. I mean, just know, other than primal fear or rage or something of the like, Ukyo doesn't really emote much throughout the series. Notice how he doesn't really have any personable moments with anyone. He doesn't really have any moments with Tessai where the two have a heart-to-heart. He never really seems close to his dad. He doesn't seem close to anyone other than himself. Now, someone might say, oh, he loves Kiara, but again, I don't think that's true. I think he just sees her as a possession more than a person. All of this backs up his psychopathy. But his psychopathy is very well suited to someone in a political or business scene. He's a real Sigma male, if you will, and he's always at that grind set, utilizing his resources as best as he can to focus in on himself. And yes, while he is good at feigning concern, he doesn't actually seem to exercise any of this and seems unbothered by his lack of actual human connection. I mean, just look at how he does his prime minister here. This is not the action of a man who actually cares about any human around him. He literally uses him as a meat shield. Again, other than a fear of death, smug arrogance, or some kind of primal fears that we see emote due to his hatred of mechanical samurai, he doesn't really have any human moments. Never a single personable scene. I mean, the man sent a hit squad after his own dad, after all. A man who, while also scummy, did genuinely adopt him and try his best to raise him, in his own weird way. And again, although Ukyo excels at feigning concern, and at exploiting and utilizing the systems he has at his disposal efficiently, he still wants more, and cannot handle not getting it, even though at this point he's more powerful than any other character here in terms of, like, political clout. He cannot take no, though, and, as someone on that grind set, figures that he needs to have what he needs to have in order to focus in on himself as best as possible. As such, he goes on a revenge quest, and, he single-handedly destroys himself by embarking on said quest because he got rejected by a girl. And, While it may seem like I'm kind of rushing this flaws paragraph, it's for good reason. While there's a lot to analyze in terms of his actions and political theories and how he manipulates everyone around him, when it comes to Ukyo as a person, while he does steal every scene he's in, there isn't much to him, substance-wise. And that's one of the reasons I find him so interesting and such a good exercise in writing. His lack of personable substance, his lack of humanity, really shows us the dangers of focusing exclusively on oneself and focusing solely on acquisition of things. He's an excellent example of someone that you don't want to be like, and, if you are, you might want to question your ways a little bit. Therefore, while there is a lot to analyze in terms of Ukyo's actions and political theories, and he's always a great scene stealer, I will say he's quite entertaining, he doesn't really have much character. Like most Sigma males, and even his literal name, an antiquated term which roughly translates to floating, fleeting, and/or transient, he is simply an empty man who spends the ample time given to him ultimately pursuing pointless tasks, which even when accomplished, don't really do much in the long term. While his surface level accomplishments are great, becoming emperor and leading over a great mass of people, he throws it all away due to his selfishness, and in the end, accomplishes nothing of any real value. However, while he accomplishes very little in-universe in the long term, as one of the adaptation original characters, Ukyo is very successful as he proves that the writers were very capable of adapting the source material to fit their own unique vision of Akira Kurosawa's original work. One character that does not do this, though, and the other side of the adaptation struggle, is Kiara, who, while starting off strong, becomes an example of what happens when writers don't map out a character's storyline that well, and the pitfalls of trying to simultaneously not change source material, but put one's own spin on it. Kiara is probably the hardest character to look at least in my eyes and from a logistical standpoint. And I say this because Kiara stands out as the only major character other than Ukyo, which is completely original to this adaptation of Seven Samurai. And this affects her in very odd and inconsistent ways. While it does give the writers free rein to build a character from the ground up, like they did with Ukyo, doing so seems to be hampered by the desire to prevent any great altering to any other characters present, or any events too drastically. As a result, Kiara is both a very important character, and, especially near the end of the series, one of very wavering significance. Unlike Ukyo, who kind of comes into his own and very clearly takes over his scenes, Kiara kind of just folds into the background of the series, and over time, her presence slowly declines. It's a very odd place to be in, and the logistics of her character and its presence fascinate me simply because I don't necessarily understand why it ended up being this way. Before we go more into depth about that though, what's her place in the story? Now, Kiara is introduced in episode 1 as the water priestess / shrine maiden of Kana Village. She serves a very important purpose as a sort of divine dowser of water, and from the start her dowsing abilities seem to be very strong. She also exhibits a strong sense of confidence and independence because of this. Wanting to utilize all of these, she thus volunteers to recruit samurai in the city. This sees her brave the city and Ukyo's advances upon her for her entire stay there, as she uses her abilities to douse for samurai. She even proves herself to be very brave and confident when she jumps from a great height to avoid capture, gambling that Kanbei will save her even though he says he wants nothing to do with this quest. He does save her, and thus, inadvertently, this action of hers recruits him and lays the foundations for the team. In the meantime, she also forges a sort of romantic bond with Katsushiro, and ponders if she made the right decision in coming to the city. She is very good at dowsing though, and through her efforts, and the efforts of those around her, a team is constructed and returns to Kana. In Kana, she has a heart-to-heart with Katsushiro, helping him rebound from having killed a man, and leads the women in prayer during the battle. Later, she serves as a sort of decoy for the samurai infiltration of the bandit base. This is kind of confusing as she doesn't really seem to distract anyone, but I guess it could also be argued that she didn't really intend to distract so much as offer herself up to save the villagers which the bandits seemed intent on killing. Anyways, she does some more praying during the final battles and helps the village rebuild. Up until this point, about halfway in the series, Kiara has been relatively significant, although notably absent from fight scenes. Her presence starts to waver from here though, and I say this because, well, you'll see why. It initially seems the opposite though, as she joins up with Katsushiro and Kikuchiyo to rescue Kanbei. However, since this entire thing becomes a sort of B-plot element for the next couple episodes, and since she's one of 4 characters as part of it, her screen time is by default quite limited for these episodes. The conclusion of the Kanbei rescue arc sees her make a few more strong showings though. including talking Sane through her difficulties, and even slapping/breaking up with Katsushiro. From here, it seems that her character can make a resurgence and maybe even get back to important character status. As such, she returns home with the main group, although, again, takes no part in battle, other than avoiding Ukyo's last advance. All of this comes after an awkward confession scene to Kanbei, which of course we will talk about. And in the last 12 minutes of the last episode, she just kind of shows up to make one more advance on Katsushiro, get rejected, harvest some rice, and then pass on her dowsing bracelet to Komachi. Again, this plot summary sounds kind of incoherent, and this is because her appearances, again after that point I mentioned, become a little incoherent. She becomes a main character of a B-plot, which by default limits her presence, and then, since she isn't present in a lot of the fight scenes, and a lot of the later episodes are big fight scenes, she just kind of disappears for 5 or 6 episodes. I mean, she does appear in those episodes, but she doesn't necessarily do too much as a character. This inconsistency of actions and appearances leads to a sort of fuzzy and half-baked image of Kiara as a character. While she definitely has enough screen time and character to warrant her presence through and through, and she's definitely a defined person, it often feels like she isn't a quite complete person, and is often quite underutilized. As such, I will look at her character before circling back onto how the writing issues present kind of impact it, and perhaps why she is so underutilized/underdeveloped. Now, Kiara's character is interesting in that it is a tad tragic in both the story and the literal telling of the story. From the start, she asserts herself as a confident and brave young woman, someone who knows what she's capable of and wants to capitalize on that. We see this from her introduction as she volunteers to go to the dangerous city, where she performs many brave acts, like jumping from the tall pipe to avoid certain capture. This brave streak continues throughout the series, and it is reaffirmed by many of her actions, such as joining the quest to rescue Kanbei. She's very confident in herself, and she's very willing to put herself in harm's way. She does not, however, like the idea of those around her coming into harm's way, as she is greatly concerned with the welfare of the people around her, and this of course extends to the samurai who would later join her and the village of Kana. We see this in many of her interactions as well. She begs an initially reclusive Kanbei to help the village. She refuses to feast at the Firefly Inn because she knows that the villagers are not eating as well, and she supports Katsushiro partly because she feels guilty for sort of destroying his innocence by recruiting him for this dangerous and transformative adventure. Her concern is tantamount in many of her interactions, and it displays her to be a rather serious and understanding person when needed. She is someone who is in touch with the big picture, and as such knows her place in it, and that place is to recruit the samurai necessary to defend the village as a whole. A village which she is very personally connected to, and which she feels personally responsible to. All of this sets up Kiara's character as one of a very mature and confident woman, who is willing to take fire for her beliefs, and in order to help those around her. However, where this character builds up very strongly in the first episodes she is in, again, past a certain point, this kind of peters out. She isn't quite done growing, though, and this is where things start to get a tad tragic. From the lofty and admittedly not very defined heights of her introduction, Kiara's imperfections and immaturity start to seep in as the series progresses. We first see this when she's very weary of Kuzo. We next see this when she starts to doubt her interactions with Katsushiro and even his feelings for him. Finally, it accumulates with the uncomfortable confession scene to Kanbei, who professionally says no. Compounding this is her then later advance on Katsushiro, a seemingly backtrack of earlier disconnect from him. And while some of these actions feel like the natural downside to being a confident person, some of it, especially the weird Kanbei scene, just feel like borderline character assassination. Now, I'm not saying that this was done intentionally to make her look bad or bring her character down. I'm just saying that it seems like at a point, the writers wanted to take the character in new directions but lacked the screen time or know-how on how to do so properly. Now, there is nothing wrong with writing an immature character, especially if the intention is for that character to either display growth or the dangers of not growing. Kiara isn't tragic because she has immature or human moments, but because her immature moments increase as time goes on, showing not growth, but regression. And this regression manifests itself in that she doesn't seem as warm of a person as she did in the beginning of the series. While her warmth is definitely still there in her last few appearances over the last, say, 4 or 5 episodes, it's not as pronounced as it used to be. Past a certain point, Kiara seems to grow very tired of the world, and a bit jaded even. She seems to be bogged down by the constant nature of conflict, and it seems as though she started doubting both herself and her decisions. This manifests itself in a sort of uncertainty which we see in some of her later appearances. The show even provides us with a unique visual to confirm this. As the series progresses, her water amulet becomes muddied over time, eventually becoming useless to her and having to be passed on to her sister Komachi. This is tragic because it shows the physical and emotional toll the events have had on her person. These physical and mental tolls on Kiara's health kind of convey the whole point of her character, and that point is that conflict negatively affects almost everyone involved, even if they are not directly involved in the fighting itself. As a sort of tertiary actor in the conflict, if you will, she's still negatively affected by it because those close to her and areas close to her are still negatively affected by it. She's close to the village, which is practically destroyed, and she's close to the villagers and the samurai, whom unfortunately suffer some casualties, even deaths. This shows us that the world is not necessarily the most fair, and that even if one doesn't fight themselves, they are not necessarily spared from the wraths of war. This ties into one of the main themes of the series itself, which is that war is not necessarily a glorious thing, and that even if done in self-defense, is not necessarily glorious. It may be necessary from time to time to fight, but fighting should never be idealized as something good and pure. And of course we see this with a ton of characters like Kanbei, Katsushiro, the other samurai. Kiara conveys this from a sort of different angle though. She conveys war affects civilians negatively, even though that they themselves are civilians and not combatants in the most technical sense of the term. And her character does a good job showing this, with the growth in her uncertainty and the growth in her questioning and the sort of disconnect she starts to form in some sort of way. I don't really know how to describe it. I mean, obviously she's still warm, she still loves her sister, she's not a horrible person, she's still a good person at the end of the series, but you can definitely tell that there is some darkness or disconnect or coldness in her heart that's brought out more to the forefront because of these traumatic and negative experiences she has had from conflict, even though that she herself does not directly fight in said conflicts. Her character does a good job conveying this. And this may also facilitate doubt and emotional wavering. And perhaps this even is why she did the whole Kanbei confession scene. She's simply seeking comfort because she has lost touch with what comforts her. And while this is a neat arc in principle of someone growing weary, a sort of downfall if you will, her screen presence and scenes devoted especially to her are not enough to necessarily pull this off well. And I think that's one of the problems of her character, and her writing, which we'll get more into. But even a character who regresses can still be quite endearing and teach us a good many things, though this is where the literal tragedy of her character comes in, the tragedy on the scale of storytelling. And that tragedy is that Kiara as a character, past a certain episode, is too underutilized and underdeveloped to show this kind of arc well. Well, I think I see what they were going for. That is, Kiara slowly becoming frustrated and angry with the world, showing that it isn't perfect. It's just that the lack of screen presence and the lack of big event dedicated strictly to her kind of hamper this. I mean, if you think about it, Kiara's character is kind of a blank slate throughout a lot of the series. I mean, obviously, she does have sort of an arc, which I've commented on, but in terms of her actual character, her personality is not really that much. I mean, she's characterized as nice and kind and relatively intelligent and responsible, but other than that, we don't really understand her as a person per se. I guess the closest window we get to seeing her is when she has some more tender moments with Katsushiro, but this just kind of reinforces the whole, oh, she's a caring and supportive woman narrative. It doesn't offer too deep of a glimpse into her character. I mean, if you look at, say, Kanbei, you can tell that this is a man who's seen a lot, he's done a lot, but he has nuance to him. He seems like a really mean guy, but he's really not. Or if you look at, say, Ukyo, same thing, there's a lot of nuance. He just comes off as a sort of playboy at first who doesn't really care about anything, and then we see that's true. However, he does it in a very Machiavellian, very manipulative, political theory kind of way. Or if we, say, look at even a different supporting character, like, say, Gorobei. His character doesn't have too much screen time, isn't, like, super developed, but it has a very unique feel to it. You can tell that this guy, he's kind of just out there trolling everyone. He enjoys being out there in the fight and kind of saying, oh, you can't hit me. He's a showman. He has a very specific air to him. And I guess what I'm saying is that Kiara kind of lacks an air or a presence. The writers didn't do the very best job of really fleshing out her presence in the series. I mean, she's in a lot of it, and she does do some very important things, but she always kind of comes off as a sort of blank slate. It seems that a lot of the times the writers didn't necessarily use her as a character, but more of a sort of tool to convey certain points. Like, I don't want to say that this is a character who's completely shaped by their interactions with other characters, but Kiara kind of comes off in that way. Every character is going to be shaped by some extent to some other characters, like Kanbei teaches Katsushiro how to grow up and stuff like that. But Kiara especially, to me, feels unduly shaped by those around her. I mean, think about every, important moment she has. The pipe scene where she proves she's brave. She does that because Kanbei's around, or any of the Katsushiro scenes with her romance. I mean, obviously I touched on the romance aspect in the Katsushiro video. They do genuinely seem to be interested in each other for at least a little bit and take some kind of comfort in each other. But every one of those formative scenes is just as formative for him, and he has a big input on them as well. What I'm saying is that a lot of Kiara's scenes feel dominated by other characters, and as a result it doesn't feel like she really comes into her own so much as help other characters come into their own. And I guess that is a compliment to her supportive nature, but at the same time it feels as though she never got the spotlight she needed. The only moment I can think of her doing something entirely on her own, just saying, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna assert myself, just gonna establish myself. The only moment I can think of where she completely does that on her own is the very beginning of the series where she volunteers to go to the city. I'm not sure, but I think that every other, quote, big Kiara moment after that involves some other character either greatly shaping the interaction in that scene or being the kind of target of that scene, or a mixture of the two. It just feels like she never quite came into her own and that she was underutilized on the whole. And I feel like that's kind of a tragic thing on her character that I wanted to touch on. Tragedy from an underutilization and storytelling perspective. The underuse and underdevelopment of her as a whole interrupts her growth and arguably even shatters her character. Now, what I mean when I say this is that past the first battles for Kana, she feels undercooked, inconsistent, and even like two different characters at different points. Episode 3 Kiara does not feel anything like episode 23 Kiara. While the first half of the series does a relatively good job establishing her as a strong, confident woman, her lack of presence past this point makes her regression feel kind of forced, rushed, and arbitrary, and all of this is detrimental to her character. Again, I think I see that they were trying to put a sort of arc in, a sort of arc where she loses her innocence and becomes world-weary, but her lack of presence means that this arc cannot be pulled off very well. Again, this leads me to ask, why is this so, though? And admittedly, this logistical part is what I find the most interesting and honestly confusing about her character, as I have theories but no real answers as to why it is the way it is. At first, I thought that, her character lacks screen time because it is an entirely original character, and the writers don't want to tweak the source material too much. I then realized, though, that this argument doesn't make any sense, as her major presence in the beginning of the series already tweaks the source material quite a bit, and again, that's fine, that's them making their own adaptation of the story. I have no issue with that, and the writers prove that they're capable of doing so very well because of Ukyo's existence, which is another nail in the coffin of the idea that they only limited her screen time because they didn't want to tweak the source material too much. In fact, I think Kiara and Ukyo are a great example of opposites on how additions to source material can really make it a writer's own unique adaptation of the material. Kiara's presence is tied to the source material as closely as possible to facilitate actions which already would have taken place and to flesh out characters who are already supposed to be on the cast and already supposed to be doing what they are doing currently. She serves to emphasize the events and characters more original to the source, and kind of add an additional lens through which to view them. Ukyo, on the other hand, is the exact opposite, as his character is loud, pronounced, and arrogant. It serves only itself, even from a writing point of view, in that it adds tension and conflicts completely new to the material, and adds dimensions to the material that were not previously present. Kiara exists to reinforce the source material, while Ukyo exists to create a new source of material. And again, this isn't really relevant, I just thought that was very fascinating. This still doesn't explain, though, why Kiara's development kind of tails off halfway through the series. If anything, the beginning of the anime-exclusive events, i.e. the second half of the plot, should be the place for an anime-exclusive character to shine, as it means that the writers can get away with a lot more in respect to the source material. In fact, I thought this was where the series was going to go, as Kiara was again seemingly poised to be a main character after having missed a few episodes due to her not being any fight scenes. I was kind of hoping, in fact, that the source material would be tucked away for a bit and Kiara could even come into her own, perhaps even fighting. I was hoping that she could, capitalize on the unique water powers, or at least divining powers she seems to have, and perhaps even use these to fight, unlocking cool predictive and water-based abilities. But no. Instead, Kiara is kind of forced into the background of the B-plot, and it's all downhill from there. The only reason I can think of why this is so is simple time crunch, maybe. Maybe the staff simply had too many characters and plot points, and not enough time and money, and therefore focused on the ones that they thought were the most important at the expense of others. And, since this is an adaptation of source material that they needed to stick to, obviously there were points that were more important than the anime exclusive stuff. perhaps there were plot points which would have given Kiara a more coherent character arc, and that they simply didn't make it off the drawing board. Again, I don't dislike Kiara's character, I think it is strong, and I think her presence in the first quarter to third to half of the series showed great potential. I think that had the writers had more time, or for whatever reason were able to flesh out her character more, I think it could have been a great standalone character. Proof that they were doing a good job of making the source material their own. Which, again, they proved capable of doing, as Ukyo was a great addition to the source material. It seems like they wanted to do something similar with Kiara, too, as the first episode sets her up as a main character, if not the main character, which, to be honest, I thought was the case initially. But they just kind of dropped the ball. From here, she goes to main supporting character, to a supporting character, to a background character. Again, Ukyo proved that anime original characters can work extremely well, and that the writers are competent. So I just can't help reflect on the tragedy of Kiara's underdevelopment. As a character who, again, I thought might have even been the main character, was reduced to a side note in the show which she helped kick off. Again, while her character is very strong and confident, it seems that the writers didn't feel the same when it came to writing her character and developing it. Finally, that leads to a discussion on Rikichi, one of the simultaneously least and yet most important elements of this story. It can honestly be debated on whether or not Rikichi is important enough to warrant a video. Could be argued not, he's really more of a supporting character, though unlike Kiara, his sort of sidelining is much more quick and it does feel a lot more natural. I did decide to do a video on him though, a short one, because he is in the movie, so I'd need a sort of baseline to compare to when I do the movie comparison video, and because Rikichi offers a unique perspective that no one else really does, that of a relatively powerless individual getting by. Now Rikichi is introduced in episode 1, as the guy the village elder assigns to get the samurai from town. As such, he accompanies Kiara to the town and generally assists in recruiting samurai, though doesn't honestly do too much. His real development comes in the caves though, where, after kind of hitting on some random woman, he reveals that the bandits took his wife, and that he wants her back after having lived in denial and trying to move on for so long. He is, however, paralyzed by his lack of power in this situation, and this probably explains why he tried to move on so desperately. In fact, he's frustrated with it so much that he takes Gorobei's sword and even attempts to charge a bandit mech, although the suicide charge is stopped, and Kanbei does promise to help get his wife back after the defense of Kana village. In said defense, Rikichi does take a part, and between battles even tries briefly learning the ways of the blade. Once the next battle begins though, Rikichi goes back to the bow, and even tries to shoot a mech with its own giant mech gun, although the recoil from this action essentially turns his ribs into dust. This great injury further sidelines Rikichi and sees him unable to accompany either Kanbei or those going after him to rescue his wife, although he does meet up with the group and his newly freed wife Sanae at the Firefly Inn. And it is here where Rikichi's humanity is truly exposed, as he has to work through not only talking his wife through her massive trauma, but also her possible Stockholm Syndrome. This of course is incredibly distressing for him, though he does eventually help Sanae transition to a healthier mental state and into the woman that she was before. Finally, Rikichi is still too injured to really fight in the final battle with the capital, although he does take the woman home and is later shown to have settled back into farming with a now seemingly recovered and loving Sanae. All of this is to say that while Rikichi is a supporting character who is put in the background relatively early on, the writers do a good job in establishing this A, early, and B, still managing to give him an impact even in his limited supporting role. And that impact is that he conveys the perspective of someone who is powerless in a world ruled over by those of great power. In fact, Rikichi being a background character kind of even enhances this impact, as it shows his lack of power, and that regardless of power, we are all still humans and can get by. Above all, I dedicated this video because I wanted to talk on how Rikichi is a look on how those abused by the powerful navigate and develop in response to it. Because of his peasant background and perspective, Rikichi is one of the, if not the most realistic of all the characters in the show. This realism is Rikichi's greatest gift to the series. The fact that he is in the background, the fact that he can't really do too much, shows that there is a sort of grounded element to the series, and that it's aware of itself and its themes, showing how the nature of conflict can be truly ruinous to everyone, especially those who don't necessarily have the power to fight, or the biggest power to fight. This lack of power, in turn, allows Rikichi to be a great exploration of humanity, as we can see how someone realistically would deal with all the issues that come up to him. If we were characters in that universe, we would probably be in Rikichi's shoes, not necessarily any of the samurai, and it's his realistic experiences and character growth and kind of arc which allow us to see the true humanity present within the series. Again, all of Rikichi's moments and expressions are incredibly realistic. On one hand, he's just some guy trying to get by, and he's doing his best to do so. He knows that getting down on himself and the world won't necessarily help him. He knows that he needs to be strong in order to carry on. However, as a realistic human, he also has emotions, and that the grinding experiences of the world around him are getting to him, and we see him suffer moments of emotional distress from time to time. Again, very realistic moments. They're not over the top, but instead very human, as we see a man portraying very raw humanity. Again, while he does have some level of stoicism, it's also present that he's under a great deal of distress. Moments like this don't show that he's weak. They show that he's been through a lot, and they show the human core of the series. Therefore, Rikichi's continued background presence allows for continuous moments of humanity at its most pure and raw expressions. He isn't a fighter, he isn't the brightest, he's just a man who wants to live a quiet life and farm his rice. He has his pride and feelings, but is relatively well balanced, and exceedingly average. He is an everyman who realistically can't really do too much against the oppressive systems in place on his own, and is thus beaten down by them. He knows he can't really change the system though, and resolves to simply bear the weight and go on living, trying to keep moving forward as best he can, in spite of the setbacks that he has suffered. He does this in order to not only ignore his pain, but to try and make genuine progress in combating it eventually. Keeping his head down forever isn't sustainable, of course, though, and he is eventually frustrated and crushed by his lack of power, even seeking to improve his status through attempting to learn the way of the blade. Although the system present is so powerful that realistically he couldn't really do too much about it alone, whether or not he actually learns how his sword works. He's a brutally realistic portrait of, hey, life is unfair, you're gonna get screwed. And the realistic grievances of his character, of course, extend into his realistic reactions of them. At first, he knows his place in the system, and that it's a very poor place that he can't really do too much about. He thus tries to keep his head down and not acknowledge how everything is going. And he tries to move on, even though this may not be the best thing moving on so quickly. We could see this in that he doesn't mention his wife till they get to the caves, after sort of hitting on this other woman, in a sad attempt to try and move on. Another realistic response that we see later is his attempt to fight back after being pushed past the breaking point, getting himself hurt in the process, fighting out of his league. Eventually, while resting, he starts to reflect, and eventually even stumbles his way through helping his wife recover from her own trauma. And while admittedly he doesn't do the best job helping Sane, he does make an attempt, and the portrayal of his attempt is one of the most touching and realistic I have seen in any media when it comes to someone helping someone else recover from trauma. He knows that she's been through a lot, but he also knows he literally can't feel her feelings, so there's a sort of disconnect. He has no real idea on what to do. He wants her to be okay, but can't really make her okay. You can't simply just make someone better instantly. He still wants to try though, so he tells her everything will be okay in a meek attempt to try and hold everything together. But it's not super effective, and we soon see him fall into distress as the pain of watching his wife suffer stares him in the eyes, and he weeps for he knows he simply cannot make that pain go away, even though he's trying his best. His best efforts aren't eliciting much of a big response. He shows the pain of someone watching their loved ones in pain, and this makes the scenes he shares with Sane at the inn some of the most heartbreaking in the entire series. She's hurting, and he wants to help, but realistically he can't help at the moment, and so too experiences great pain. This is the pinnacle of Rikichi's presence in both the series and the series' realism, and it's a realism of seeing a man suffering because those around him are suffering, and because the world is just coming down so hard on all of them right now. This is a scene of humanity. However, in keeping with reality, the worst possible outcome is not always guaranteed. There are times of improvement and joy. People can get through a surprising amount of things and continue moving forward. And fortunately for everyone, Rikichi's continued presence and growing understanding of Sane, and Sane's supportive environment, seem to help her recover, and she does eventually seem to make a full recovery. And the portrayal of this is also realistic. There is no anime speech moment where someone simply says, "Sane, you're gonna make it," and then she feels better. There is no anime speech moment where Sane herself declares that she will be better all of a sudden. There is no simple, easy fix, and no simple click where everything is better. No, instead there is a very realistic portrayal of a slow and gradual improvement. I mean, it makes sense. Her condition is not a good one, and it's kind of a miracle she's as good as she is when she's first recovered. She's been through a lot. And as such, there's no realistic way to portray a fast recovery. No. Instead, there is a slow and gradual improvement with her condition. She goes from denial, to silence, to muted engagement, to normal talking, to even smiling in her final scene. A final scene which Note, you probably takes at least several months, if not at least half a year, after her introduction back to Rikichi. This is a realistic portrayal of someone taking time that they need in order to get through a series of very traumatic events. And I appreciate the realism of the series. And it's kind of the strength of both Sane and Rikichi. All of this is capped off in the final scene where Sane smiles at Rikichi and takes his place in the fields, showing that the two now seem to have gone through the worst and are making genuine progress towards harvesting a better life. And again, while a good deal of this arc is kind of in the background, this kind of enhances it, as it shows that there's always some humanity in the background regardless of the situation. It is a well-written exploration of the human condition, condensed in the two supporting characters. Rikichi and Sane are very realistic characters, showing us that yes, life will suck sometimes, we will all have our struggles, but even if not glamorous or fast, we can still get through them into a better tomorrow. With the characters of the series examined, let's get into a few of the themes. Now, a lot of these themes are applicable to both this adaptation of the movie and the original movie itself. When coming up with themes for this video, I came up with several that were all kind of related, and for this reason kind of just decided to meld them all together, as it felt like making a video on one without the other would kind of be incomplete. As such, this video will examine the series' position on battle, honor, and glory, and how the portrayal of such concepts supports an overall message of pacifism. Now, in a piece titled Samurai 7, which prominently features cool samurai battles, there are some surface-level expectations that come about simply hearing the title of the series and, seeing a few highlights of it. These surface-level expectations and/or cliches is that this will be a tale of righteous violence done by a group of honorable men against crude bandits, and that our heroes will redeem everyone in a furor of holy combat. That is to say that combat will be glorified and ennobled as a tool of justice. Now, Samurai 7 does almost everything in its power to say the exact opposite, though. While the honorable men against crude bandits part can, probably be taken at face value, the rest cannot. Violence is never portrayed in this series as anything more than a necessary evil at most, and no one is really 100% redeemed. In fact, everyone kind of just loses at least part of themselves along the way. We can see this in numerous characters, like Katsushiro, who loses his naivete and innocence, and even Kanbei, who has already lost it long ago, and as such is kind of a cold, hollowed-out shell of a man. There is no happy, clean ending where everyone just goes, yeah! We won that massive battle, cured my inner demons, and had no losses of our own or long-term psychological damage resulting for it. Everything's great now. No, instead it's a very realistic portrayal of violence and suffering, showing that even victory in combat has its costs. Violence is never glorified, and instead shown to be a sort of corrupting miasma which negatively affects all involved, even if their involvement is justified. Violence corrupts and brings down, and while some things need to be brought down, violence is not the optimal solution, only one of last resort to be used in desperation. While individual warriors can conduct themselves honorably, there is no honor in the concept of violence itself, and battles are not scenes of glory, but instead of horror and suffering. The expectation of a noble battle is shattered again and again throughout the series, as battle is shown to be more of a brutal struggle in the mud if anything else. And even when the test of battle is passed, it still haunts all those who took part in it. We can see this most with the most and least experienced samurai of the cast, Kanbei and Katsushiro. Katsushiro is young and naive. He serves as sort of an ill-informed youth, looking towards fighting under the false precepts of honor and glory, and therefore also as sort of a viewer POV. As he experiences hardships, though, and pain in battle, and, personal loss and growth, his illusions of glory and honor are slowly washed away, and in turn, so are those of the viewer. In fact, this is one of the greatest parts of his evolution, watching him slowly realize that by ingraining himself into conflict, he has ingrained conflict within himself. Sure, his engagement can be justified. I'm not arguing he's a bad person. However, justified or not, he cannot undo any of the things that he has done, or the mental scarring received as part of this. While it is true that he did the right thing, he still had to take methods which were damaging to himself, that were still traumatizing. He still suffered for doing the right thing. This just shows that while the use of violence can be justified, violence itself is never something positive or fun. It's tragic because even though Katsushiro wielded violence for good, he is still negatively affected by it, simply because violence itself is such a strong and traumatizing force. We also see this in Kanbei, a man whose extensive experiences have numbed him to many other things in the world. He has ditched all precepts of righteous fury and glory and honor in combat, and instead kind of just goes with the narrative that he's done what he's had to do, he'll do what he'll have to do, and that he's kind of just an empty loser at this point, blowing about in the wind. In him, we see a man who has lost his naivete and innocence and even joy long ago. He's paid the price for having done what he's done, and while realizing that he had to pay it and it was the right thing to do, it was not a positive experience. He is still a good man, but because of his many violent experiences, he's also a man in great pain, and a man who could never return to the bright youth he probably once was. Instead, now, he's a tired and cynical man, simply going about different motions of existing. Through these characters and many others in Samurai 7, the series in turn says that conflict isn't glorious or honorable, and that it should only be sought out and performed when necessary. The idea that glory can be found on a battlefield is shot down pretty early, and instead simply shown to be a naive foible. Dying in and of itself is not glorious, and sacrifice is not the same as simply getting yourself killed. Simply getting killed for an abstract concept like glory is a bit silly, as there's no point in seeking a reward if you can only get that reward by dying. Therefore, true glory and victory comes in simply surviving, living into the future so you can hopefully make one where violence doesn't befall the people as much as it did in your own time. All of this, of course, is provided that your own victory and survival in battle didn't come at dishonorable means, as employing dishonorable means is, pretty obviously also dishonorable and bad. Samurai 7 establishes that conflict is inherently bad and or not glorious, and that simply dying is not necessarily glorious either. And this leads us to ask, what is it to be an honorable warrior, then? Is it even possible to be one? To answer the first question, Samurai 7 does seem to say that yes, it is possible to be an honorable warrior, though doing so ironically requires a sort of disdain for violence. An honorable warrior must realize that they must only fight when absolutely necessary, and they must have the necessary restraint and control to only use the amount of violence needed. This is because a righteous warrior needs to know of the unrighteous nature of violence, and the need to resort to it only when needed. What truly determines whether or not a warrior is honorable boils down to the methods he employs and why he fights. To start, an honorable warrior should employ some kind of code of honor in fights, not necessarily anything super extensive or drastic enough to greatly restrict his actions, but enough to ensure he doesn't go overboard and stays loyal to his cause. And that cause, most importantly, determines what makes a fight honorable. Fighting solely to exploit others, or to hurt others, or to prove your own power to others, or simply go out of your way to try and flex on others is dishonorable. Fighting for oneself and or to protect and prove oneself in times of great stress or need is neutral. There is nothing wrong with raising a hand in defense if you have literally no other options. And fighting for the sake of those who cannot fight, for the sake of the weak, to maintain justice and honor, and to put down those who seek to use their force for dishonorable means, is honorable. While the samurai themselves do not necessarily hold themselves up to be the best or most honorable men, we can clearly see they are, as this is what they fight for. They fight for an insignificant group of people who can't fight for themselves. They put themselves at the disposal of others, and in this selfless act prove themselves to be truly honorable. Against this are the crude bandits, who fight only for themselves, and for this reason, and for their barbarous methods employed, are proven to be dishonorable. However, note, while this may or may not determine which warriors are honorable or not, it doesn't make the violence they perform righteous. It only justifies it as an inevitable tragedy. While adapting Kurosawa's original 1956 masterpiece was a no doubt daunting task, it was done very well here, so as such I feel it important to compare the adaptation to the original source material and see how the adaptation has excelled in both adapting it and setting its own path. This leads us to a discussion of how those plots line up. Now, this will be the longest portion of this video, so please ignore the timestamps present in the edited footage, as those are no longer accurate. Also, please ignore the fact that everything from the original movie has to be freeze-framed due to copyright issues, and the fact that some of the soundtrack used in the background is not original to this or the movie because, repeating the same 45 minutes ad nauseum may get a little repetitive. Quick little post-production note here. Due to copyright issues, most of the clips from the actual movie had to be cut out and condensed into sort of still frame images. I did this by simply turning the speed on the scenes down from normal speed to 2.0000002 in my editor, so if the frames seem to jump every now and again, that is normal. Your eyes aren't playing tricks on you, there is some limited degree of movement. And I just wanted to put this in here because I know if someone saw this video without knowing that, they'd probably question why I wouldn't use actual clips from the movie, but they're very stringent about copyright with this production, even though it is quite dated. I hope you enjoyed anyways. I did put a lot of work into it, and I did have fun making it. Now, for quick context sake, Seven Samurai is Kurosawa's masterpiece, and it was made in 1954, hence it's in black and white, and is quite old. However, that doesn't detract from the fact that it is one of the most influential works of film from that era, if not film in its entirety. And it's not hard to cite parallels between it and later productions whose aspects it may have inspired. However, the point of this video is not to analyze Seven Samurai itself, as, again, as one of the most influential pieces of all time, I feel that's beyond the scope of the video. It's simply to compare the anime that has been the subject of our previous analysis with the source material in question. Now, Seven Samurai is 3.5 hours long, with a 6 or 7 minute intermission around the 1 hour and 50 minute mark, so it is quite a hefty production. However, we should note that that is still only about 12-20 minute segments if we wanted to compare it to the anime, which is 26 episodes long. So let's just see what happened with an additional 14 episodes of content. To start, we're going to be comparing the plots and just kind of overviewing them. Then we'll move into the little character details and miscellaneous things I thought were notable. Now, the plot of Seven Samurai in Samurai 7, of course, is that a village is sick of being held down by the bandits which torture and exploit it, and thus seeks samurai in order to protect the village. There's a very similar opening scene, with bandits nearing and looking over the village, plotting on when to attack it next. Similarly, there's also a mating scene in the house of the elder, who decides that they will hire samurai. However, the first variation between the original movie and the anime adaptation appears here, and that variation is who gets sent to the city. Now, Rikichi is still present, and he still volunteers to go out into the city to recruit samurai. However, as noted in other videos, Kiara is an anime exclusive character. She doesn't show up in the scene or the movie at all. Instead, 3 other men are sent with Rikichi to the city, one of which is Gonzo, another is Yohei, and I don't remember the 4th man's name. Next. Similarly, there's also a mating scene in the house of the elder, who decides that they will hire samurai. However, the first variation between the original movie and the anime adaptation appears here, and that variation is who gets sent to the city. Now, Rikichi is still present, and he still volunteers to go out into the city to recruit samurai. However, as noted in other videos, Kiara is an anime exclusive character. She doesn't show up in the scene or the movie at all. Instead, 3 other men are sent with Rikichi to the city, one of which is Gonzo, another is Yohei, and I don't remember the 4th man's name. These 4 go to the city to recruit samurai. In both adaptations of the story, the recruitment team gets to the city where they live with some hecklers. Now, at first I thought these weird heckler guys were just kind of a thing that were in the anime in the background. I never paid much attention to them. However, in the original movie they're actually quite important. They kind of psychologically torture Monzo and the others. However, their goading and sadistic nature also is what ends up convincing Kanbei, who is tired of them looking down upon him for refusing to help them. This is an important difference in both the source material and the anime adaptation. This has the same result of Kanbei joining the team. Of course, the only reason the team knows about Kanbei in the first place is because, as in both versions, there is a similar scene of a child being held hostage in which Kanbei rescues the child. In both versions, Kanbei uses some sort of disguise. In the original movie, he pretends to be a monk and offers rice to the bandit holding the child hostage, while in the anime version, he simply uses a false name, which I thought was interesting that they both kind of tried to keep the element of disguise present. This also leads to the scene in both versions where Katsushiro asks Kanbei to be his master. However, in the original source material, this goes very differently. In the anime adaptation, where he's very bluntly refused at first, Kanbei informs him that he doesn't agree with this, although he doesn't necessarily shoo him away, in fact pushing him along with him to avoid a Kikuchiyo, who shows up in the scene in the original movie to kind of just stare Kanbei down. Again, this is a difference between the anime adaptation and the original version. This then leads us to the trolling hecklers, which, as we mentioned earlier, are the ones that persuade Kanbei to join instead of Kiara. And this really kind of gets us right into the recruitment phase of both the anime and the original source material. However, due to the source material's length, this of course is a rather quicker process. Instead of Gorobei being introduced with the arrows scene, he is instead introduced with the stick test scene, where Katsushiro holds a stick over his head in the doorway to strike him. However, Gorobei notices before he even enters and passes the test. There's also a humorous moment where they employ the stick scene on some other person who, if you were not familiar with the original movie but had seen the anime, you might have thought was Gorobei. However, that guy leaves. And that was kind of funny. The team does experience a setback when the rice is stolen. In the anime, this is done almost as soon as the group enters the town, and is kind of resolved by Katsushiro. However, in the original source material, this happens after they start recruiting other samurai, and is instead resolved when Katsushiro simply throws money at the problem. He literally throws money at the villagers to go buy more rice. While the methods Katsushiro employs are different in both versions, this is still a good establishment of his character as someone who believes in righteous virtue and such. Anyways, the recruitment process speeds along, and Shichiroji is the third samurai to join. Now, the anime takes a lot of liberties with how he joins the team. In the anime, Kanbei and the group are on the run from city authorities and flee to Shichiroji's hotel, where they later recruit him and he goes along with them to the caves. However, in the source material, Shichiroji just kind of shows up, recognizes Kanbei, and says, "Yeah, I got nothing to do. Let's do it." And he joins up almost immediately. This is a good example of how the anime kind of embellishes or stretches the source material, as Shichiroji joining in the anime is kind of the result of a bigger action that is also an anime adaptation edition, the Samurai Sweep of the City, and therefore takes up a lot more time. If we figure in the sweep episode and, Shichiroji's episode, it's probably about 40 minutes of getting Shichiroji to join, where in the movie it's probably a 2 or 3, maybe 4-minute sequence where he just kind of shows up and says, "Yeah, I'm down." That's not me complaining about the movie being short, it's not, and it's not me saying that the anime made too much stuff up. I'd just like to note that due to the difference in length, the anime does do a lot of its own things to get to the same skeletal points of the movie. With Shichiroji joining third, the group next recruits Heihachi, who again is just chopping wood in some guy's backyard. However, there's no search for him like in the anime, but instead Gorobei simply walks up to him and recruits him. Now, there are some differences between his character and a lot of the characters, in fact, between their original version and the anime adaptation, and I'll get into that later. I just thought I would say that now. Next, the group recruits Kyuzo, and his recruitment is very different than in the anime. The anime did a lot of additions to his backstory and to how he came to join the team. In the anime, of course, he works for the city boss, he's kind of a bad mercenary guy, he just kind of does his own thing. He goes along with the city staff, the bad guys, up until they reach the desert, where he betrays them in order to live his own life. While that does a good deal of fleshing out his character, we should note that that is anime exclusive. In the original movie, he kind of just shows up one day dueling some rando in a field for practice sake, and then when the rando gets mad, he kills him in self-defense. This establishes him as a man who just wants to test his skills, as Kanbei puts it. There is no fight with Kanbei himself, and Kikuchiyo is not someone who actually wants to fight Kanbei at any point in the original movie. In both versions, Kikuchiyo is not recruited immediately, and Kanbei kind of just lets him go off on his own thing. I would like to point out, though, that this movie does set an important precedence that would later be used in many other movies, and in many other animes, and many other television productions in general. I'm pretty sure it's not the first to do this, but I did notice it very prevalently in certain scenes. And that, of course, is the classic man dying to slow-mo. And I'm pretty sure it happened before the Kikuchiyo scene, but I noticed it most prominently during the Kikuchiyo scene. I just thought that was a fun little production note. The group then goes back to their little room in the town, and they proceed to talk strategy. Once again, Katsushiro isn't considered a real samurai by Kanbei and is told to leave. In the anime version, he kind of just sits around and says, whatever, I'll go anyways. In this version, he gets upset, walks out of the room for literally 2 minutes, and then everyone calls him back and he says, "Yeah, I'm a samurai now," which, I thought was kind of funny, honestly. I had no problem with that. One of the beggars then tells them of another samurai who is coming this way that they can recruit, and quote, "fights like a mad dog." This is Kikuchiyo, who, as we all know, is not a real samurai, and in this scene is drunk. His recruitment is also vastly different in both versions of the story. In the anime, Komachi sees him as a strong guy and just kind of recruits him, and then he just kind of goes along with the team from there. In the original story, however, he had been aware of the group and had seen Kanbei do some cool samurai stuff, and had a sort of inferiority complex towards Kanbei, since, Kikuchiyo knows he's not a real samurai. And this kind of festers in the background. He shows up in a few scenes, doesn't really say anything, stares a few characters down, and in this scene, he's actually recruited last, as he shows up drunk, fails the stick test, pulls out the same genealogy as in both versions, and then ends up falling asleep in a pile of hay. Also, for some reason, Kikuchiyo's in the background of this scene the whole time. He just kind of walks up, you can see him in the very back of the frame, and no one notices him, and then Kikuchiyo says, "When are we leaving? I'm on board." I thought it was really funny, Because he literally, no one knows he's there, and then he just joins up. There's no real explanation for this. He never really saw any of the samurai beforehand. He didn't really know what was going on, or at least I don't know. It's a long movie. I might have forgot a few minutes there, but it just seems as though he shows up randomly and joins, which not the most explanation, but I'm fine with that. That's fine. With the samurai preparing to go back to the village, though, we next cut back to the village, where the Monzo making Shino cut her hair plot is still there, and, well, this guy wasn't likable in either version of the story, and I'll leave it there for now. This will have more impact on it, though, in the original source material, and we'll get back to that in a little while. Anyways, as in both versions, Kikuchiyo follows the group along back to the village, and, as in both versions, no one really welcomes the samurai at the village, but instead, they find an empty square. However, the resolution of the scene is different in both versions. In the anime, Kikuchiyo kind of just proves that hiding people won't necessarily work, and the villagers have to stand up for themselves by trolling everyone in a sort of physical sense. He goes out, he proves he can find where the rice is stored, and he says, hey guys, this isn't going to work. In the movie version, however, he sounds the bandit alarm, summons everyone to the center of the village, makes everyone panic, and then just starts demeaning everyone. He kind of just trolls everyone, he yells at them, he kind of makes fun of them for being scared. And then Kanbei awkwardly laughs, and a few of the villagers awkwardly laugh, and then, well, that just kind of sets the stage. It's a really weird scene. Again, he kind of just resolves the issue by just trolling everyone. He doesn't come off as necessarily trying to be nice or trying to reconcile. He really just seems like he's kind of annoyed, and he just wants to, screw with people at this point. His character is very different in both adaptations, and we'll get to that. It's a weird scene, but it is kind of funny. Another scene of his that is in both versions is the kimono scene, where, while in Rikichi's house, he dances around in his wife's kimono. And again, this triggers Rikichi. However, before this scene in the anime, due to the cave addition to the story, we knew about Rikichi's wife and where she was. However, in the movie, none of that had been explained yet, and this really starts to open Rikichi's character up. At this point in the movie, he's been upset, and we can tell that he hates the bandits, but it hasn't really been expounded upon. We kind of just assume, oh, he's a farmer, he hates them, obviously. But the kimono scene opens up Rikichi's character to us even more as we start to see the story of his wife and whatnot. And again, that's explored more later. Another difference in these two versions of the story is that in the anime, Kuzuyo trains everyone on bows, which makes sense, it's a ranged weapon. However, in the original movie, the samurai know that they're going against mounted opponents, and as such, they train everyone on spears. So Kuzuyo trains everyone on spears and not bows. The next point in the movie is one that's entirely original to the movie, and I thought was odd that the anime didn't adapt in any way, especially because the anime does give shoutouts to things that it made irrelevant but still happened in the movie. For example, in the movie, the bandits from earlier are very relevant as they kind of heckle Kanbei into joining the team, but in the anime, since Kiara persuades him her own way, the hecklers aren't needed in the anime. They could have cut that out, but they kept them in just to prove, they know the source material. It's like an attention to detail kind of thing, and I respect that. So I found it really odd that the anime did not adapt the next kind of little plot point, which takes like 10-15 minutes of the movie, and that plot point is that the villagers have a stash of plundered samurai weapons and armor. Now, as someone who isn't a real samurai, Kikuchiyo sees no problem with this, and he brings it out, and he flaunts it, and he's like, guys, look at all this cool stuff. However, Shichiroji, of all people, has an emotional outburst saying that that's wrong, he wants all that out of there, this is disgusting, and then all the samurai kind of share disgust at the villagers over all this. At first, this doesn't really make sense, but Kanbei explains it as, we're samurai, we've seen a lot, it's very disturbing for us to see samurai weapons and armor paraded around like that, because those were once worn by living people, that could be us. Now, of course, those were bandits that the armor belonged to, but it's the same concept. I think Kanbei literally says, they don't know what it's like to be hunted. And I see why that's disturbing to the samurai. It's basically the equivalent of someone parading around a dead corpse and saying, yeah, we got him. I mean, it's good that you defended yourself, but it's a little excessive, And this leads to the samurai kind of disliking a lot of the villagers. Shichiroji, in fact, goes as far to say that he wouldn't mind killing a few. However, in the original movie, this is actually when Kikuchiyo gives the whole it's everyone's fault speech, i.e. the speech where he blames the samurai for victimizing the farmers, and he blames the farmers for being kind of wily and not necessarily the best sports. And this speech is the one that truly reconciles the samurai to the farmers. However, in this version of the story, he only gives it to the samurai. The farmers are not present for this. Although, They do seem to get along with the samurai better after both this scene and the scene mentioned earlier where Kikuchiyo just kind of trolls everyone. As the group figures out how to fortify the village, Katsushiro just decides to run off in a flower field and lie down, where he meets Shino. Now again, in the anime, Shino's just kind of a background character who, having 2 minutes of fame for having Gonzo cut her hair, doesn't really do anything after that. In this version of the story, since Kiara is absent, she's actually the main love interest for Katsushiro, and the two have a very weird and uncomfortable on-screen chemistry. Maybe because of how dated the movie is, it just feels odd looking at it from today's perspective, but it really does feel really odd how in most of their scenes she's either laughing very happily or seems extremely upset. And it's not like he did anything crazy either. She just kind of gets upset randomly. And, I mean, they explain it. She's like, oh, we're different social classes. Oh, I'm scared. Oh, this, oh, that. And, like, it makes sense on paper, but just the portrayal of it's kind of uncomfortable. It doesn't seem like he's done anything, like, horrible, per se. It just seems like she's kind of upset or unstable a lot. And I just thought I would mention that. Anyway, since she's the main love interest in the original movie, she's actually a lot more important in the original movie, and her role is very downplayed in the anime adaptation. In the original movie, Katsushiro meets her while they're in the flower field, and since her hair is short, and she says she's a boy, he kind of beats her up, saying she should be training to defend the village, and then finds out she's a girl, and then awkwardly just walks away. The two are later witnessed by Kyuzo, who is a good sport. He doesn't tell anyone, but he knows what's happening. And as the training for defense continues, the farmers are organized into squads for both harvesting and for war. Now, some of them, of course, don't want to sacrifice their houses on the other side of the bridge. However, Kanbei lays down the law rather quickly, and in this version is shown to be a more military kind of guy. Next, there's another tense scene with Shino, which I find uncomfortable. Maybe it played differently back then or for different people, but it just seems weird. She always seems like kind of upset, but you can't really tell. It's odd, it's uncomfortable, it's awkward for me. I don't know how others would feel about it. You know, you can see it yourself. I just thought I would note that. And next is another scene which the anime adaptation left out. And this is the scene where 3 of the samurai go to the bandit camp. They figure they're outnumbered, so they should strike first, whittle down their numbers, and try to forward their position a little bit. And this scene actually is where Rikichi's wife, who's unnamed in this version, in the original version, is actually introduced. Again, she's been kidnapped by the bandits and is just kind of living with them, and also seems to exhibit some kind of Stockholm syndrome. As in the original version, she runs back into the burning bandit lair to try and either run from Rikichi or save a bandit that might have kidnapped her. It is very traumatizing for Rikichi. However, while the anime adaptation has a kind of nice resolution where Rikichi helps his wife get over Stockholm syndrome and everything goes well, in the original version, she kind of just runs into a burning building and probably dies, while Rikichi has a nervous breakdown in the open, which leads Heihachi to try and drag him back behind cover, which ends up in Heihachi getting shot, which is another major departure between the anime adaptation and the original version. As in the anime adaptation, Gorobei is the first samurai to die. However, in this version, Heihachi is. I postulate that that's because in the anime, this scene isn't included, the scene is cut out. Therefore, Heihachi's death is kind of cut out, and they have to force it to happen later on, which they do. And Gorobei's is simply next in line, but since that scene is cut out, it's the first one we experience in the anime. Again, though, this is a very traumatic scene for Rikichi, and as in both versions, he has to kind of live with the loss of his wife. However, in the movie version, he doesn't get her back, unfortunately. And this leads to the first funeral scene. And again, this scene is very different than how it is in the anime. In the anime, by this point, Kanbei has left, Gorobei is buried, everyone kind of just sits on the hill, feels sad for themselves a little bit, and then goes on to the next arc, the woman rescue arc, which is not in the movie at all, I just thought I'd say that. In the original version, though, the group buries Heihachi on the hill, and everyone is sad, of course, and Kikuchiyo tries to raise everyone's spirit by hanging up the new flag of the village on one of the houses. It's the same flag in both versions, however, in this version the flag is made by Heihachi himself, so it serves as kind of a good memorial to him, and a good way to raise spirits at the same time. However, right after he does this, again in another major difference between the two, the bandits kind of just show up mid-funeral, and then the first battle just kicks off right there, all of a sudden. And in this battle, we see that each of the samurai has their posts, and we see another difference in the two versions of the story. In the anime adaptation, the old man, the elder, lives through the whole thing, more or less for the better. However, in this version, he doesn't want to leave his house on the other side of the bridge, and basically gets toasted. There's another poignant scene here, where Kikuchiyo rescues a baby from that burning building and is kind of disturbed. He has a moment where he says, "This baby is me. I was like that at one point. I hate the bandits. That's why I'm a samurai now." And it's a really good character moment for a guy who so far has just been kind of a crazy weirdo. Again, more on that later. And this leads to the first big battle scene, and obviously it's the 1950s. The special effects are limited by, the time period. The fight choreography is limited by the time period. And if you look super closely and you watch the scenes at like half speed, you can tell that the actors are stabbing the ground next to the guy that fell off the horse and everything. It's not the most realistic all of the time, but that's not something I hold against the movie. The atmosphere at this point is so good that your suspension of disbelief will easily excuse that. Thought it was something that I did notice. But the battle scene itself goes relatively well for the samurai, other than the losses of the old man and the houses on the other side of the bridge. And there is a piece, and this leads us to one of the in-between battle scenes. Now, the anime had these two, it had a few episodes between battles, and a good portion of the movie is also spent between this first battle and the next couple battles. In both versions, Kuzo kind of just goes off on his own to scout and steal a gun, somehow killing 3 guys on his own and making it back unscathed. While this is the end of that little thing, in the anime version, it does have a bigger impact in the original version, as this later inspires Kikuchiyo in the original movie to try and do the same thing, where he also steals a gun and manages to get back. However, again, he's kind of roasted because he did this for his own glory and not necessarily for the team. And as he returns from that sort of solo mission, another battle starts, which again goes relatively well for the samurai. They use a strategy of kind of just baiting in a few horsemen, killing them, baiting in a few more, killing them. They get a few more guys like that. Doesn't work forever though, and Gorobei unfortunately gets off-screened. We just hear a gunshot, and next thing you know, a few guys are carrying him in, and it's obvious he's not doing too well. He just gets off-screen, which I thought was kind of weird. But again, I mean, it makes sense. It's a realistic battle. It's chaotic. You don't know when someone's going to die. No issue with that. This, of course, does darken the mood quite a bit, as it does in both versions. And it leads to the weird conclusion of the Shino Katsushiro arc, where both of them get scared and spend the night rolling around in the hay. That's not an innuendo. Look at all that hay. And anyways, Monzo catches her and kind of just relentlessly beats her. Again, he's very unlikable in both versions of the story. And that's the most important thing that happens in this sort of interlude between the second battle and the final battle. Kanbei himself says this will be the final battle because both sides are losing men, and it's now or never, basically. This final battle is set in the rain, and it goes pretty well for the samurai at first. However, with the bandits going all out, they do inflict some grievous losses on the samurai. Kuzo is the first of the remaining samurai to go down. He just gets shot. This one is on screen. He gets shot, stumbles a little, and then dies in the mud. Very unglamorous death. Again, very realistic. This movie is quite visceral. In both versions, he's the third samurai to die, which means that it's time for the final samurai to die. In both versions, again, this is Kikuchiyo. However, his death is different in the original movie. In the original movie, the bandit lord by this point is hiding because he knows he's screwed, and he hides in the house with all the women that try and take them captive and bargain his way out. Kikuchiyo knows this though, and just runs in, sword a-blazing, gets shot point blank, and then keeps going and stabs the bandit leader. I like how in both versions of the story, it's this guy who's been screwed over by the system the most, is the guy that ends up taking out the big bad guy. And in the original version, it's just the bandit leader, just some guy with a gang, basically. In the anime adaptation, it is, of course, Ukyo. However, Ukyo is anime exclusive. He's completely original to that. He's not in the original movie. Next, of course, the movie ends on the famous scene of the samurai just kind of recounting what's happened, Kanbei saying that it was the villagers who won and that he's lost again, and, of course, the final shot of the samurai burial mounds, really bringing home the somber message of the pointless nature of violence and conflict. Anyways, with the differences in plot discussed, and I guess the plot of both kind of dissected thoroughly, let's get into some character differences. Now, as mentioned earlier, the movie has quite a large cast and 3.5 hours, so not everyone is going to be completely fleshed out. And the anime has basically 14 additional episodes to add different plot points that expound on different things, and kind of take the characters in their own direction as part of making the adaptation its own thing. So, I think the best way to organize this section of the video is just to look at different characters and compare the anime version to the source material. And of course, we'll do a little segment on every character that got their own video, and any others that I thought were of note. So, we'll start with the first samurai that we started with, and that, of course, is Gorobei. Now, in the anime version, Gorobei is very fleshed out as a guy that loves life, he kind of likes spitting in the face of death. He's a performer, and he's good at what he does. He's a wizened veteran who very much enjoys his life. In the original movie, he's a very similar person. He does enjoy his life. However, he doesn't necessarily make a point of putting on a show of it. He's not as showy, and he just comes off more as some guy's dad. I don't know how else to describe it. He just seems like a very nice, amicable guy who's simply there to help. He does look kind of like a used car salesman, but I have no problem with that. I dig the beard. And he's very much closer in the original version than he is in the anime. In the anime, the role of Shichiroji and Gorobei is kind of swapped, because in the original version, Shichiroji, while being Kanbei's friend, doesn't necessarily do that much with him. They share a few jokes and they seem to enjoy each other's company, but they never really confide in each other like they do in the anime. In the original movie, it's actually Gorobei that Kanbei seems to confide in most, and the two have a very good, friendly working relation throughout the entirety of the movie, as Gorobei naturally assumes a sort of second-in-command position who kind of always knows what Kanbei's thinking. In the anime adaptation, this is kind of taken over by Shichiroji, which I guess makes sense because the two do have a past together, so it makes sense to establish that. It makes sense to establish Shichiroji as kind of Kanbei's old friend and second-in-command, as opposed to Gorobei. However, in the original movie, it is Gorobei, and while his characterization is similar, I just thought that was a very important difference between the two versions to note. Next, let's touch on Kuzo. In both versions of the story, Kuzo is just some guy who's very good at what he does and kind of just enjoys being good at what he does. However, while his character is similar in both versions, how he necessarily comes to join the team and a few other things are not. As mentioned earlier, the anime has a very long sort of subplot where Kuzo betrays the wrong side to join up with the samurais and the right side, living his own path while being very helpful to those around him. In this version, Kuzo just kind of does his own thing for a little bit, and then again randomly just instant transmissions into the background of one scene with the samurai and says, "When are we leaving for combat?" Kind of just joins up randomly and goes along with the group. However, he does talk slightly more in the original movie, which I thought was funny, and he comes off as an old guy who just kind of likes memeing. I don't know how to describe it really. In the anime version, he barely smiles. He's very serious. He's over the top, kind of like edgy anime sword guy. He's cool, but he doesn't talk. He's like, "I'm just here to get the job done, guys." In the original movie, though, he's actually an older gentleman, and he seems to be more acquainted with life and had a lot of life experiences. And we see him go along with a lot of the jokes that Heihachi cracks. He's usually laughing. He usually seems to be in a good mood. He's very good at what he does, and he does seem to take the mission seriously, but he doesn't necessarily seem to take himself too seriously. He enjoys laughing. He has a few funny scenes. I think he even cracks a joke at one point. In fact, while I do like both versions of the character, I think I prefer the original version, as it does make sense that the skilled swords guy would be an older gentleman, someone who's had a lot of experience, and that an older person would kind of just have fun memeing on everyone, or like dunking on everyone. Like, he even jokes at one point, which I thought was hilarious, because from the anime, he's super serious, he never talks. And in the movie, he's serious, he's good at what he does, but it's obvious he's also got a funnier side to him. He doesn't take everything super seriously, and he's a good mixture of experience and skill, along with knowing when to tone it down and when not to be too serious. I do like his characterization in the movie quite a bit. It's a very fun background character. However, in the movie, he does not dual wield, unfortunately. They all use, for the most part, standard katanas. On the topic of weapons, let's next get the Shichiroji. Now, one of Shichiroji's standout quirks in the anime is that he uses a spear while everyone else uses swords. In the original movie, though, he uses a sword for most of his battles. He only uses a spear at the very end when he's fighting mounted opponents, which makes sense. You want a longer reach if you're fighting a guy on a horse. So I thought that was a neat little thing that the anime kind of just ran with. But his characterization in the anime and in the original movie is quite different as well. In the anime that we've looked at so far, he's a very calm man. He's kind of Kanbei's right-hand man, as a guy who's been with him through a lot and knows how he operates and thinks very well. He's a very humanizing person, and he kind of helps Kanbei come off as more relatable. He gets that ball rolling, as we mentioned in his video, and he's a very calm, capable, confident man. In the original version, though, while he is still very likable, and he does seem to have some kind of relationship with Kanbei, his character is more volatile. We can see this especially in the scenes with plundering, where while Kanbei is obviously upset that the villagers plundered the dead bandits, Shichiroji straight up says he'd want to kill a few for that. And this is basically the difference between him in the anime and him in the original movie. In the anime, he's almost never upset. Maybe he gets a little tense sometimes, but in the original movie, he does get annoyed in a few occasions. He gets mad on a few occasions. There's a pre-mentioned scene where he said he would kill a few people over what they had done, but he still helps Kanbei's characterization. His character is still quite good, still a competent warrior, still seems to know what he's all about. However, again, as mentioned in the Gorobei segment, he doesn't seem as close to Kanbei in the original source material as he does in the new anime adaptation. However, his character is relatively similar, and is for the most part still a nice, relatively easygoing man. He does look very different though, just so you know. Again, Seven Samurai is a realistic movie with realistic aesthetics, and obviously Samurai 7 is its own very unique aesthetics, and of course you gotta take in the fact that it's an anime, and that's why Shichiroji looks like this when animated, and he looks like a used car salesman in his true form, if you will. On to the next character though, Katsushiro. In both versions of the story, Katsushiro is kind of like the young guy who everyone just They let him tag along, but they know that if push comes to shove, someone needs to tag along with him, make sure he's okay, and is kind of seen as Kanbei's like apprentice. But his characterization and his kind of arc and actions are very different in both versions of the story. In the anime, of course, Katsushiro has a weird love affair with Kiara. He kills a guy who's scouting. He has a very dramatic episode with that. He has a lot of pain. He learns a lot. He grows a lot. He trains relentlessly. And in the end, he kind of just says, I'm going to go do my own thing. I've learned what it's like to be an independent man. To which Kanbei says, you have sport, take my sword. Very fulfilling moment of self-realization where Katsushiro has basically completed his training, shown that he knows what he's doing, and that he knows who he is as a person now, and that he's ready to be a warrior who can stand on his own. Very marked growth and very obvious character arc. He goes from a naive young warrior who gets dunked on constantly to a competent young man who can stand on his own and now truly knows what it's like to be a samurai. In the movie, though, Katsushiro's arc is kind of all over the place, and he doesn't actually do almost anything. In the anime, he gets into a lot of fights, which he loses a lot of, but he's out there doing stuff. In the original movie, though, he's kind of coddled by Kanbei. Kanbei knows that this guy isn't really up to the task in front of him, so instead of letting him just get beat up and learn, Kanbei kind of just says, oh, Katsushiro, go with Kuzo, or oh, Katsushiro, stick by me, or oh, Katsushiro, stay behind. And as a result, Katsushiro doesn't really get to do too much. And his character is more devoted to the Shino arc, which, I mean, that's fine, but I do really like how the anime expanded on his character and really gave him a more concrete arc. On the topic of the Shino arc, it's funny that in both versions of the story, Katsushiro just kind of like falls in love with someone who is either not completely interested or is unstable for some reason. That's not to belittle either Shino or Kiara. It's just saying that this guy has had some awkward conversations. While the characterization of the two is very similar, naive young man, his growth is markedly increased in the anime adaptation, which was something I found a pleasant departure from the source material. It's nice that he got a lot more to do and that he grew a lot more. In addition, and because of this, his relationship with Kanbei is also a lot more fleshed out in the anime, and that's partly due to Kanbei's difference in characterization as well, though it is a nice departure from the source material. On the topic of Kanbei, his characterization is also very different in both versions. Starting with the anime version that we've talked about already, anime Kanbei is a very cold, serious man. He comes off as kind of a heartless loner, although he does prove himself to be a good man, training Katsushiro, defending the villagers for basically nothing, and establishing himself as a loser, but a righteous loser. In the original movie, though, while he does stick to the idea of being a righteous loser fighting lost battles for righteous causes, who he is as a person is actually very different. It's interesting because a lot of characters share different events and arcs, but similar characterization, where Kanbei shares a similar arc, but very different characterization. In the movie, he's pretty warm from the start. He's pretty likable from the start. He just comes off as some guy's dad, just going about giving good advice and saying common sense sentences to help those around him. He's never really rude. He never really puts on a mean face unless it's like a battle or something. He's always welcoming and warm to those around him. He never comes off as cold, which is one of the defining traits of anime Kanbei. So I just thought it was a very different version of Kanbei, and I guess it makes sense because in the original movie he's more of a central character. He's central in both the anime and original movie, but with Kiara's absence, and with Katsushiro kind of taking a back seat, Kanbei is arguably the main character of the movie. He's more present, and he's much more welcoming, which, again, I have no problem with. I like both versions of Kanbei, though, honestly, if I had to hang out with one, I would probably hang out with movie Kanbei. It's so odd, because in the anime, he almost never smiles, and in the original movie, he just seems like he's having fun a lot of the time. He laughs at Kikuchiyo's weird or dumb jokes. He kind of memes himself sometimes. It's a very different characterization, and I do like both versions of it, although I think that I do appreciate the warmth of the source material more than the austere exterior present in the kind of anime version. Again, the anime is longer, so it gave him more time to develop and grow into a warmer version of himself, but I don't mind seeing that version right off the bat, as they do in the movie. Speaking of warmth, let's next talk about Heihachi. Now, again, the anime does add a little bit to his character, in that in the anime he's a former traitor who's kind of redeeming himself, and that motivates him to join the quest and simultaneously not take himself seriously. He claims to be a pacifist, he hates fighting, he loves rice, and he wants to help the team in order to redeem himself for his past treachery. In the movie, though, he's probably the samurai with the least amount of screen time, and he doesn't have that traitor arc baked in. There's no redemption story for this guy. He's just going along because he wants to be a helpful guy, and there's nothing wrong with that. Again, he's found a similar way, cutting wood for some random person. However, the recruitment scene is also a little different. There's the same part where he humorously stumbles at being asked to cut down bandits, but when asked if he's actually cut down anyone before, in the anime, Heihachi says no, he hates violence, he thinks it's not good. In the original movie, though, he says yes. Once I start chopping, I can't stop. I don't know why they changed that in the anime, I guess to kind of put their own spin on the character, but in the movie he comes off as kind of bloodthirsty, and I don't know if that was a joke or not. It could have been a joke, because he does share the similar characteristic of being very fun-loving, very funny guy who just serves to lift the spirits of the group. In fact, I think Gorobei kind of establishes that that's why they recruited him. He straight up says, yeah, Heihachi's mid, but he says funny things, so yeah, he can come along. And of course his death is different, as mentioned earlier. In the anime he dies destroying the capital in like a redeeming explosion. In the original movie, however, he dies saving Rikichi from his own impulsive actions. So he's still a good character, just not much to touch on when comparing the two, because in the movie he's probably the least present of the samurai. Finally, that leads us to Kikuchiyo, and I saved him for last in this case because his characterization is radically different. In the anime, of course, he's kind of a fun, bumbling oaf who respects everyone around him once he warms up to them and gives it his all the time. He comes off as mentally stable, competent, and, while funny, generally aware of the situation and, consequences. And you're probably thinking, it's really weird that you would say those adjectives. They're so vague and kind of self-explanatory. But the reason I do is because in the movie, Kikuchiyo is almost a completely different person. In fact, movie Kikuchiyo even has inconsistencies within the movie, as he tends to have mood swings, or different phases, I guess you would say, throughout different parts of the movie. In some scenes, he's very warming and welcoming and understanding. In other scenes, he seems like just a malcontent who's kind of just upset and annoyed at everyone. There's other scenes where he comes off as a straight-up sociopath a few times. There's scenes that show that he's obviously aware of what's going on and that he wants to fight with the villagers because it's the right thing to do. There's other scenes where he just seems to have almost no idea what's going on and it just start yelling at everyone. He's all over the place in this movie, and I dig it. He's obviously a man who's very traumatized by his past, and they don't say that is the reason he's unstable, but knowing what we know now today about how trauma affects people, especially when in their childhood, it does make sense that a man who's been through that much would be a little unhinged every now and again. And his characterization of someone who's been through violence and is now forced to be in it again is very accurate. He's trying to make the best out of a bad situation. However, he can't always control himself that well, and as such just goes about doing either really weird or impulsive things. Some of the highlights include wearing samurai armor that he stole from a dead guy, the weird scene where he trolls all the villagers. This is literally the first time he meets them, and he literally just sounds the fire alarm for no reason, and then starts berating everyone. A lot of weird moments with this character. Very eccentric, very weird, possibly a little unhinged. And whoever was playing him just loved it. And you can tell, because even when he's in the background, he's kind of making weird faces. He makes a lot of weird faces when he talks. He just kind of says random things randomly. A lot of his deliveries are either very emotional, not necessarily the most coherent because of that. He shows himself to be something of a drunk, just a very all over the place portrayal of this character, which makes for a character in and of itself. It's obvious that this guy is a guy with trauma and that he's been through a lot, and he's trying his best to get through it, but isn't necessarily the best at it, so he's just kind of impulsively bungling his way through things, which does make sense that his character is a kind of a tragic one when you think about it in the movie, because it's clear that this man has psychological damage. He has been through a lot, and he is trying his best to get over that and to like help people around him not go through similar things. So he does prove himself to be a good fighter in that sense, and a moral fighter in that sense. It's just that it's a very pronounced struggle, and it leads him to taking a lot of all over the place actions, which may not necessarily be the best or the nicest. And it's a very different characterization. While in both versions he is kind of the comedy, funny, big guy, in the anime they obviously tone down a lot of that, and he's just kind of a comic relief character with a serious side. In the original movie, though, he's more of a, I don't want to say sociopath, he obviously has a moral compass, but I'll say a little unhinged. He comes off as unhinged in some scenes in the movie, and it's a very radically different characterization. I have no problem with it, though, as again, it is showing the effects of trauma on someone trying to deal with it as they do something else that is also traumatizing, all in the name of trying to help others. So again, his character is still interesting and fleshed out. It's just a very different character. Now that the samurai are discussed, I'd like to quickly touch on Komachi, Kiara, and Ukyo. And I mean quickly because all I'm going to say is they're literally not in the original movie. They're just anime original characters which help add to another arc of the anime. They help flesh out the anime, be its own thing. I have nothing against them in the anime. I've touched on how Kiara's execution wasn't necessarily well done. However, I've also talked about how I really think Ukyo was a great addition to the source material. It helped this adaptation really come into its own. So I don't really hold the anime original characters down because they're anime original. I like Ukyo, and I think Kiara would have been good if they did something more of her character than nothing at all. I just thought I would mention that they're anime original, and that is a great departure from the source material. Another great departure from the source material is the handling of Rikichi. Now in Rikichi's video I've mentioned how in the anime he's just kind of a background character who shows that yes, life does suck for the peasants, and he's a great display of how unfair life is towards them and how rough it can be. He also does that in the original movie. However, in the original movie, his role is much more pronounced. Since Kiara isn't in the original movie, that means that Rikichi is kind of the central villager character for us to get a real glance at how things are in the village. And his characterization is much more fleshed out because of that. Again, in the anime, he's a relatively stoic guy who's had a lot of tough times and is not doing the best because of it. In the original movie, Rikichi's just an emotional roller coaster. We see this guy cry, we see this guy get mad, we see this guy just go through almost everything, as he's lived a very unpleasant life so far, or at least as of late, and he's just not having it anymore. Although they don't necessarily add much to his arc in terms of events, the movie just adds a lot more in terms of his screen time and presence, and this allows him to just capture a lot of the scenes he's in. It allows him to just come into his own, whether he's crying at how unfair life is, or whether he's trying to convey the need to fight, or whether he's just sitting there quietly talking to himself or the samurai. Again, while he isn't necessarily given too many additional tasks to do, he doesn't necessarily do that much when we look at it objectively, his presence is just so much more pronounced that it really lets us get a look into a man who's suffered a lot and see that effect on his psyche. Finally, that just brings us to a few tertiary characters I'd like to touch on briefly. Now, a lot of tertiary characters from the anime obviously aren't in the original. The anime had a lot more time to add stuff like that in the background, and it's not necessarily needed in the movie. The tertiary characters that are in the movie include the elder of the village, who in the anime goes on to basically win the battle and be fine. However, in the original movie, he kind of just burns to death in his mill home, and, well, not necessarily the happiest ending for him. Another tertiary character is Gonzo. He's in both versions. He does slightly more in the movie version. I still hate him. At least he didn't try to sell out the samurai directly to the bandits though this time, so good on him for being slightly less scummy in the original, I guess. And that basically wraps up a look at the plot and the characters. Again, Seven Samurai is one of the most influential movies of all time, so it's very surprising to me that Samurai 7 is in turn one of the most obscure animes of all time. So I just wanted to do this little comparison video to compare the two, show the differences, and kind of make a final evaluation on what I think about the job they did adapting it. And that final opinion of mine is that they did a very good job adapting it. They kept the core skeletal points of the series the same. It's about samurai who do the right thing and defend the village from bandits, even though that requires the use of violence, which in and of itself is a negative and hurts everyone involved, even if they're fighting for a good cause. The theme that conflict is not good, but it must be done sometimes, though it's still not good even if that's necessary, is still very much present. Kanbei still talks about how every battle is a losing battle, and how that it's unfortunate that it came to this. They keep the skeleton of the plot the same, and they keep the core components of the theme the same. However, with the anime having a much longer runtimes, and the necessary need to make it its own thing, the anime does a very good job in establishing a unique setting, adding a few extra characters to flesh everything out, adding an additional arc to increase runtime and help it stand on its own, and just all the additions that help it make it its own thing. There are almost no additions to the anime which I feel drag down the series. Now, the movie is obviously more impactful, objectively. However, I think there's no problem with liking both versions of the story. And there's almost no addition the anime made that I felt was tacked on or bad. The only exception perhaps being what they did to Kiara, but I don't hate her character, I don't hate the fact that she's in the anime, I just think that they could have handled it better, as I've mentioned multiple times before. In conclusion, I think that these are both masterpieces, and that both should be enjoyed, as one is one of the greatest films of all time, a great film memory, if you will, and the other is almost a completely unheard of anime, a great obscure anime memory. Having finished our extensive look on it, I just would like to summarize my final thoughts on the series and why I think it's a great one at that. Now, as always, we're going to start this little conclusion video with a few housekeeping notes that I felt had nowhere else to go. Now, again, this series has a lot of tertiary characters, which, while interesting, I don't really necessarily have time to cover or dedicate videos to. Amaro was interesting as Ukyo's adopted father. He did try to raise him the best he could. However, as someone with a flawed moral compass, the definition of best is not necessarily the morally best. There's Kikuchiyo's older man, Masamune, who's implied to have cyberized him, and comes off as a nice father figure for him, although he doesn't really do that much again. There's other tertiary samurai, which serve as city enforcers, who, while cool, don't really do that much or necessarily have the most screen time. Of these, Tessai had the most, and was actually really cool. I like the twist that he was actually super competent, and it was also funny when he gets one-shot by Kyuzo. However, again, these characters are kind of background characters, and therefore don't necessarily justify a video of their own. Then there's the character of Komachi, Kiara's sister. Now, I've already kind of touched on how Kiara's character development is flawed due to a lack of screen time, and Komachi doesn't necessarily suffer this. Her character is pretty consistent throughout the series. However, her character is also pretty tertiary throughout the series. She doesn't really do that much aside from recruiting Kikuchiyo, and always just kind of serves as a comedy character in the background who lightens the mood when things might get a little tough. That's not necessarily to say that she drags the series down, it's just to say that she doesn't necessarily do that much in it. Although, again, she's a child, so I'm not saying that she needed to have a drastic impact on the battles, because that's not necessarily the most realistic. She's just a child doing child stuff in the background, who, again, as a tertiary character, doesn't necessarily impact the story that much, and so didn't warrant a video or much mention on her own. Komachi is kind of placed into a comedy role that she doesn't really escape from, and doesn't really do much other than elicit laughs. I also kind of struggled with the theme video component of this retrospective, as I felt there was only really one theme with this series, and that was the grim nature of battle and violence. So I decided to put all of the theme component kind of into that one video, as I feel the other themes were kind of dispersed throughout the series, or not nearly as important as that one. Of course, we can learn a lot from 7 Samurai and Samurai 7, it's just that I felt that theme video was the one that really stuck out to me, and I feel that it does deserve to sort of stand on its own. Anyways, for my thoughts on Samurai 7, having completed my first watch-through of it relatively recently, my first complete watch-through, I will admit I was a bit skeptical on how well an adaptation of a classic movie could be made into an anime. Knowing that the movie was only 3.5 hours long, I wondered how they could come up with a good 26 episodes of content and keep it both entertaining and loyal to the source material. I was very happily surprised though when Samurai 7 managed to add things to the story to keep it moving and interesting, while maintaining the core of it to show true respect to the source material of 7 Samurai. I find that all of the characters, while different from the source material, are still very likable and endearing, and, with their additional screen time, also a little bit more fleshed out in many cases. I find that the original core tenets and morals of the story are the same, however, and that the same human impact is still there. An impact of people going through tough times and struggling through violence and struggles, sometimes emerging damaged, but emerging stronger nonetheless. This true impact of the old movie has been combined with a beautiful new set of paint, with a beautiful new OST, with a beautiful new set of secondary stories to develop our characters that we've come to know and love. I find that it is an excellent fusion of both source material and new additions to said source material to create a sort of beautiful hybrid of old and new. It is something which has a newer appearance, it's animated, it has some CG, and it's futuristic, but it maintains its roots in the past, lovingly serving to portray the morals and the human side of Seven Samurai, all the while connecting to the past of Japan itself. It is a letter and labor of love to both the future and anime and the past and the work of Kurosawa, like Seven Samurai. It is a beautiful masterpiece. I appreciate your views, and for those of you who have subscribed or subscriptions, again, this is just something I do because, well, I need something to do with my time, but I really do appreciate all the time that you've given me. And I thank you for that. And I hope that you enjoy more productions from this channel, and that I hope that I can continue to make productions for as long as feasible, so that we can continue to revel in some great, obscure anime memories.